Pay the rent or get out." My daughter-in-law Brittany shouted those exact words right in the middle of my 62nd birthday dinner. She stood at the head of my own antique dining table, smirking down at me like she had just won the ultimate prize. I looked her straight in the eyes, completely unfazed, and what I did next left her absolutely speechless. My name is Yvonne. I am 62 years old, and I spent my entire career as a commercial real estate appraiser. I know the true value of a property, and I know a complete fraud when I see one. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an entitled relative exactly who holds the power in the family. Now let me tell you how my own son and his greedy wife tried to steal my kingdom. The evening started out normally enough. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking a massive feast for my family. My house, a beautiful, sprawling property I purchased decades ago with my own hard-earned money, smelled like roasted chicken, savory collard greens, and fresh peach cobbler. I was celebrating my 62nd birthday, and I naively thought my son DeAndre and his wife Brittany were actually there to celebrate my life and show a little gratitude. DeAndre is 35 years old and has always been my golden child. I gave him absolutely everything I possibly could to make sure he succeeded in this harsh world. Brittany, on the other hand, is a 32-year-old woman who desperately wants to be a luxury lifestyle influencer. She spends her days taking pictures in expensive clothes she cannot afford and looking down her nose at anyone who actually works for a living. I always knew she was entitled and spoiled, but I never realized just how dangerous her greed had become until the birthday cake was finally cleared from the table. The dining room was filled with the soft, warm glow of the crystal chandelier. I was sitting at the foot of the long table, sipping my sweet tea and enjoying the quiet, peaceful moment in the home I had built from the ground up. That is when Brittany suddenly stood up from her chair. She picked up her crystal wine glass and clinked it loudly with a heavy silver spoon. The sharp, ringing sound cut aggressively through the comfortable silence of the room. Everyone stopped talking and looked directly at her. Brittany smoothed down the front of her designer dress and offered me a bright, completely fake smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I honestly thought it was a birthday card or perhaps a generous gift certificate to a nice restaurant to show their appreciation. I was completely and utterly wrong. "Happy birthday, Yvonne," Brittany said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension that immediately set my teeth on edge. DeAndre and I have been talking a lot lately about the future and about our overall family finances. As you know, my luxury lifestyle brand is expanding very rapidly, and we need to restructure our assets to maximize our cash flow. We have a very special gift for you tonight. It is a wonderful opportunity for you to finally contribute to the massive success of this family. She tossed the heavy manila envelope onto the polished mahogany table. It slid quickly across the smooth, dark wood and stopped directly in front of my plate. I looked down at the envelope and then back up at my daughter-in-law. My real estate appraiser instincts, the ones that kept me sharp and wealthy for 30 years, immediately kicked into high gear. I had spent 3 decades examining complex legal documents and sniffing out bad investments. A heavy manila envelope delivered with a fake smile is absolutely never a good thing in my experience. "Open it," Yvonne Brittany urged, crossing her thin arms tightly over her chest. I slowly opened the metal clasp and pulled out the thick stack of printed papers. I did not even need my reading glasses to understand exactly what I was looking at. Right at the very top, printed in bold, aggressive black letters, was a formal residential lease agreement. Attached to the very front of that lease was an official 30-day eviction notice. My heart skipped a single heavy beat, but my face remained an absolute mask of perfect calm. I slowly placed the papers back onto the table, lining them up neatly, and looked up at my daughter-in-law. "What exactly is this, Brittany?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady and completely even. Brittany let out a loud, dramatic sigh, acting as if she were speaking to a slow and very stubborn child who could not grasp a simple concept. "It is a lease agreement, Yvonne," she announced loudly, making sure her harsh voice echoed off my beautiful dining room walls. We are implementing a few new rules around here starting today. You have been living in this massive house absolutely rent-free for way too long. It is not fair to DeAndre, and it is certainly not fair to me. You are just a retired old woman, Brittany continued, her tone becoming much sharper and far more aggressive. You sit around all day watering your garden and living completely off your son's hard work. DeAndre is the man of the house now. He is a successful professional, and he is funding my entire luxury brand. We need serious capital to grow. We cannot afford to just let you completely freeload off our success while we are trying to build our massive empire. Therefore, starting on the 1st of next month, your new rent is $2,500. If you cannot afford to pay that amount, you will need to pack your bags and vacate the premises by the end of the 30 days. We can easily rent this prime property out to high-paying corporate clients who actually respect the value of luxury real estate. So basically, Yvonne, it is time for you to pay the rent or get out. The sheer unadulterated audacity of her cruel words hung heavily in the air, completely suffocating the entire room. I sat there in absolute stunned silence. $2,500 a month to live in my own house. The house I bought and paid for completely in cash before Brittany even graduated from middle school. The house where I raised my children as a single mother, working grueling 80-hour weeks, analyzing commercial properties, and fighting through a heavily male-dominated industry to secure my total financial independence. I did not owe a single dime to anyone on this entire earth. And yet here was this arrogant little girl standing in my dining room, demanding that I pay her for the basic privilege of sleeping in my own bed. She actually believed she held the power to throw me out onto the street. I did not yell. I did not flip the heavy table or throw my glass of sweet tea in her smug, pale face. I knew exactly how to handle hostile and aggressive negotiations, and the very first rule of any major conflict is to never let the enemy see your true emotions. I slowly turned my head away from Brittany and looked directly across the length of the table at my son. DeAndre was sitting rigidly in his chair, wearing a nice, expensive suit that I had probably paid for a few years ago. I waited patiently for him to speak. I waited for my golden child, the boy I had sacrificed absolutely everything for, to stand up and forcefully put his out-of-control wife in her proper place. I fully expected him to snatch those insulting papers off the table, tear them into tiny shreds, and apologize profusely to me for her incredibly disrespectful and unhinged behavior. He was a grown man, and he needed to act like one. But DeAndre did not stand up. He did not say a single defensive word. Instead, my 35-year-old son slowly lowered his head. He absolutely refused to look me in the eyes. He stared intensely down at his half-eaten slice of peach cobbler, his broad shoulders slumped forward in a pathetic posture of complete and utter cowardice. The heavy, suffocating silence stretched on for several long, agonizing seconds. The dark, terrifying truth finally crashed down on me with the devastating force of a massive wrecking ball. This was not just a crazy, impulsive stunt pulled by an entitled daughter-in-law looking for attention. DeAndre actually knew about this. He had fully agreed to this terrible plan. My own flesh and blood, my only son had sat in his expensive car, driven to my house, eaten the birthday dinner I lovingly cooked for him, and sat entirely silently while his wife tried to illegally evict me from my own property. Brittany crossed her arms even tighter, a smug, victorious smirk spreading widely across her face. She looked at DeAndre and then back at me, completely convinced that she had just executed a flawless power move. She truly believed that she had intimidated me into complete submission. She thought I was just a tired, lonely old woman who would simply roll over and empty her hard-earned retirement accounts just to keep the fragile peace in the family. She thought her husband somehow magically owned my kingdom, and she genuinely thought she was the new wealthy queen. I looked deeply at the eviction notice resting quietly on my polished mahogany table. My heart was completely shattered into a million pieces by my son's massive betrayal, but that profound sadness was quickly burning away. It was being rapidly replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifying rage. DeAndre had foolishly chosen his side, and Brittany had just officially declared war on a woman who spent 30 years destroying fraudulent empires for a living. I did not say a single word. I just smiled a slow, chilling smile that made the smug look completely vanish from Brittany's face. The birthday dinner was officially over, and the total destruction of her fake luxury life was about to begin. The heavy silence in my dining room was finally broken by the awkward scraping of wooden chairs against the hardwood floor. The few extended family members and close church friends who had gathered to celebrate my 62nd birthday could not scramble out of my house fast enough. They hastily gathered their coats, offering quiet, mumbled apologies while completely avoiding making direct eye contact with me. Nobody wanted to be caught in the middle of an explosive family confrontation. Within 10 agonizing minutes, the dining room was entirely empty, leaving behind half-eaten plates of peach cobbler and a chilling sense of absolute betrayal. I remained seated perfectly still at the head of the mahogany table, staring blankly at the printed eviction notice resting near my plate until I heard the heavy front door finally click shut. The lock sliding into place sounded like a definitive punctuation mark on the life I thought I knew. Once the guests were gone, I slowly stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my dress. I picked up the thick stack of legal papers and walked deliberately toward the kitchen. As I approached the swinging kitchen doors, I could hear the hushed, frantic whispers of my son DeAndre echoing sharply off the granite countertops. He was pacing rapidly back and forth, running his hands nervously over his face and breathing heavily. When he saw me step into the bright fluorescent kitchen light, he immediately stopped pacing and took a defensive step backward. He looked exactly like a frightened child who had just been caught stealing from a candy store, but the stakes tonight were infinitely higher. He had just cowardly allowed his greedy, manipulative wife to try and steal my entire financial kingdom right out from under my feet. "What exactly is going on, DeAndre?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and dangerously low. I walked over to the kitchen island and placed the eviction notice flat on the polished granite surface, spreading the papers out so he could see the aggressive print. "You actually sat at my dining table eating the food I cooked for you and let that horrible woman hand me a formal legal demand for rent in a house I paid off completely 10 years ago. Explain this disrespect to me right now." DeAndre swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He absolutely refused to look me in the eyes, staring instead at his own reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. "Mom, you really have to understand our position," he stammered, his voice remarkably weak and lacking any real conviction. "Brittany has been under an immense amount of professional pressure lately. Her luxury lifestyle brand is on the verge of a lucrative national breakthrough. She just needs a little more substantial capital to secure her new inventory and launch her aggressive digital marketing campaign. We are actively building a corporate empire. Mom, and sometimes building an empire requires making very tough, uncomfortable financial decisions for the greater good of the family." I stared at him, feeling a sickening twist of pure disgust in my stomach. "A tough financial decision," I repeated, shaking my head slowly in disbelief. "You casually call extorting your own hard-working mother for $2,500 a month a tough financial decision. You proudly call handing me a formal eviction notice on the night of my 62nd birthday a brilliant business strategy. DeAndre, you are a 35-year-old grown man. I raised you as a single mother, working grueling 80-hour weeks to ensure you had a strong, unbreakable backbone and a solid, righteous moral compass. I sacrificed my own comfort so you could attend the best private schools and learn how to be a responsible leader. Where exactly is your spine tonight? Why are you letting a 32-year-old internet scammer dictate how you treat the woman who gave you life?" DeAndre finally looked up, his face flushing a deep, dark, angry red. He absolutely hated being reminded of his own glaring weakness, especially by the powerful, independent woman who had sacrificed everything to make him strong. "It is not illegal extortion, Mom," he argued loudly, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to sound authoritative. "It is just basic, modern economics. We needed liquid cash immediately to scale the business. Traditional commercial business loans were taking way too long to process, and the offered interest rates were terrible. So I finally took the initiative and acted like a real provider. I went down to the local bank and I took out a massive home equity line of credit against this specific property. We needed the leverage to fund the lifestyle brand. I stared at him in complete, stunned disbelief. A home equity line of credit, I asked, my voice remaining completely ice-cold despite the blazing fire of anger burning in my chest. A HELOC. You took out a massive, risky financial loan against my fully paid-off house to fund a fake internet business that sells overpriced candles and cheap imported clothes. You cannot legally take out a bank loan against a property you absolutely do not own, DeAndre. Any basic real estate appraiser knows that simple fact. The commercial bank would never approve that major financial transaction without the primary title holder physically signing the official mortgage documents. And I can guarantee you with absolute certainty that I never signed a single piece of paper authorizing you to leverage my home. DeAndre shifted his heavy weight nervously, crossing his arms very tightly over his chest. Well, actually, Mom, you do not technically own the house anymore, he muttered quietly, looking away toward the floor tiles. When we finally processed the massive loan, the commercial bank strictly required the property deed to be officially updated to reflect the primary financial borrower. The bank legally transferred the property deed directly into my name during the final closing process. It was just a standard, boring, bureaucratic requirement to properly secure the necessary funds. I am the actual legal owner of this entire property now. And since Brittany is my legal wife, she has equal say in exactly how we manage our growing real estate portfolio. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of his fabricated story was almost comical, but I absolutely did not laugh. I knew for a proven absolute fact that a federally regulated bank could not simply transfer a property deed without the explicit notarized physical signature of the original legal owner. DeAndre had not just made a poor, impulsive financial decision to appease his wife. He had aggressively committed massive federal bank fraud and entirely forged my legal signature to steal my property. Before I could forcefully tear his pathetic lie into tiny little shreds, the swinging kitchen door flew wide open and Brittany confidently marched into the room. She had entirely traded her fake sweet birthday smile for a look of absolute cold, dark arrogance. She walked straight over to DeAndre and possessively linked her thin arm through his, pressing her body against him in a disgusting, obvious show of territorial dominance. "You clearly heard him. Yvonne," she said, her voice incredibly sharp and completely unapologetic as she glared at me. "The outdated, boring rules in this house are officially permanently over. You absolutely do not get to call the shots around here anymore. DeAndre is the sole legal owner of this massive property, and I am the new lady of the house. We have massive corporate business expenses, and we simply cannot afford to quietly subsidize your lazy, comfortable retirement." Brittany unlinked her arm and took a bold, aggressive step toward me, waving her perfectly manicured finger in my direction. "You have exactly 30 days to fully adjust to this new, modern reality, Yvonne," she sneered, her eyes flashing with greedy, malicious intent. "You will eagerly pay the $2,500 in rent on the first of every single month without fail. If you stubbornly miss a single payment, or if you foolishly try to cause any unnecessary trouble for my luxury brand, I will absolutely not hesitate to call the local sheriff and have you physically thrown out onto the street like common trash. You can go live in some cheap, tiny apartment for all I care. Do you completely understand me, Yvonne? It is my beautiful house now, and you are just a temporary, unwanted burden of a guest." They both stood there perfectly still, staring at me and eagerly waiting for the massive emotional breakdown. They fully expected me to instantly collapse onto the cold kitchen floor, begging loudly for their mercy and crying out about how incredibly unfair my life was. They desperately wanted to see me completely broken, completely ruined, and entirely defeated by their brilliant financial manipulation. But I did not shed a single solitary tear. I did not raise my voice to scream at them, and I absolutely did not beg for anything. I simply looked at my weak, pathetic, spineless son and his greedy, incredibly delusional wife. I took a slow, deep, calming breath, completely, perfectly centering my internal emotions and my racing thoughts. Then, without saying another single word to either of them, I calmly turned my back and confidently walked out of the kitchen. I climbed the long, sweeping wooden staircase, my footsteps perfectly steady and completely unfazed by their threats. I walked down the dark, quiet hallway and stepped directly into my private home study, quietly pushing the heavy oak door completely shut behind me. I knelt down on the plush, cream-colored carpet and pulled back the small, decorative woven rug to seamlessly reveal a heavy steel floor safe embedded deeply in the solid, concrete foundation. I quickly dialed the numerical combination and pulled the metal door wide open. I reached deep inside, bypassing the neat stacks of cash and the soft, velvet jewelry boxes. I pulled out a thick, heavy, legally bound folder. I placed the massive folder gently on my dark mahogany desk and slowly opened it. The title page was printed in crisp, bold black ink. It read, "Irrevocable Trust." DeAndre thought he had successfully stolen my house, but he had absolutely no idea that I had securely locked this entire estate inside an ironclad legal fortress exactly 10 years ago. He had just handed me all the perfect legal ammunition I needed to completely and absolutely destroy them forever without a single shred of mercy. The heavy oak door of my private study clicked shut securely behind me, sealing me inside the quiet sanctuary I had built over 30 long years. I stood alone in the dim room, my heart beating with a slow, rhythmic precision. Downstairs in my beautiful kitchen, my son DeAndre and his incredibly arrogant wife Brittany were probably celebrating their supposed massive victory. They actually believed they had successfully cornered me. They genuinely thought their aggressive ambush had completely broken my spirit and stripped me of my absolute financial independence. I walked slowly over to my large mahogany desk and placed my hands flat against the cool, polished wood. The thick, heavy folder I had just pulled from my hidden floor safe rested silently right in front of me. The bold black letters printed across the top cover read, "Irrevocable Trust." I stared at those two powerful words and allowed a deep, chilling sense of absolute clarity to completely wash over my mind. For over 3 decades, I worked tirelessly as a commercial real estate appraiser. My entire professional career was built entirely on uncovering hidden structural flaws, exposing deeply buried financial lies, and aggressively protecting high-value assets from greedy, manipulative investors. I survived and thrived in an incredibly ruthless male-dominated industry simply because I was absolutely meticulous. I never left a single detail to chance, and when it came to my own personal wealth, I was infinitely more protective. 10 years ago, when DeAndre was just starting his professional career and showing early troubling signs of financial irresponsibility, I made a massive legal decision. I hired the most aggressive estate attorney in the city to officially transfer the total ownership of my fully paid-off home and all my primary liquid assets directly into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is not just a simple piece of estate planning paper. It is a massive, impenetrable legal fortress. Once a property is officially placed inside that specific type of trust, the original owner legally surrenders their direct individual ownership to the trust itself. The terms absolutely cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the explicit written permission of the named trustee, which was me. More importantly, it completely, entirely shields the property from outside creditors' lawsuits and the foolish financial decisions of any future beneficiaries. Therefore, DeAndre's ridiculous, arrogant claim in the kitchen was a complete, total legal impossibility. A federally regulated commercial bank cannot and absolutely would not simply transfer a property deed into his name just because he asked for a home equity line of credit. The bank underwriters would immediately pull the title, see the irrevocable trust, and demand my physical notarized signature on every single page of the loan documents. I pulled out my comfortable leather desk chair and sat down, opening the heavy folder to review the original certified documents. As I slowly turned the crisp white pages, the terrifying reality of exactly what my son had done began to fully materialize in my mind. DeAndre did not just make a foolish administrative error. He did not simply misunderstand the complex legal nature of modern real estate law. In order to successfully secure a massive home equity line of credit against a property held in an irrevocable trust, DeAndre would have had to aggressively circumvent multiple layers of strict federal security. He would have had to completely fabricate elaborate legal documents. He would have had to actively secure a corrupt notary public to illegally stamp the paperwork. And most devastatingly of all, my own son would have had to deliberately and maliciously forge my personal signature on a stack of federal bank loan applications. He had committed massive, undeniable federal bank fraud. He had committed aggressive identity theft and severe wire fraud. These were not minor civil infractions or simple family misunderstandings. These were major federal felonies that carried mandatory minimum prison sentences of up to 30 years. I sat there in the quiet stillness of my private study, staring blindly at the legal paperwork as a deep, profound wave of maternal sorrow washed heavily over me. My golden child had completely corrupted his own soul. He had thrown away his entire future, his freedom, and his personal integrity just to appease the endless, insatiable greed of a woman who wanted to be a fake internet celebrity. My very first immediate instinct was to pick up the phone and call the federal authorities. As a licensed professional, I knew exactly which financial crimes division to contact. I could have the local police and federal investigators walking through my front door in less than 30 minutes. They would aggressively interrogate DeAndre, demand to see the original loan documents, and arrest him right there in my beautiful kitchen. It would be a swift, brutal, and entirely justified response to his ultimate betrayal. I actually reached across the desk and placed my hand on my cell phone, my fingers hovering directly over the screen. But then the sharp, analytical, forensic appraiser inside my brain completely took over, entirely silencing the deeply wounded mother. I paused and began to rapidly calculate the long-term strategic consequences of calling the police right now tonight. If DeAndre was suddenly arrested tonight, the massive federal investigation would focus entirely on him because he was the one who physically submitted the fraudulent paperwork to the bank. He would immediately go to a cold federal prison cell. But what exactly would happen to Brittany? Brittany was incredibly manipulative and exceptionally cunning. If the police arrived tonight, she would immediately turn on the fake tears and play the role of the innocent, terrified victim. She would loudly claim that DeAndre was highly emotionally abusive and that he completely controlled their finances. She would swear to the federal investigators that she had absolutely no idea where the money came from or how he secured the massive loan. And while DeAndre was sitting behind thick iron bars taking the complete absolute fall for the entire criminal operation, Brittany would quietly take the hundreds of thousands of dollars they stole from my equity and completely disappear. She would easily escape with the stolen money, rebrand her fake luxury lifestyle company, and continue completely unpunished. She would entirely ruin my son's life and walk away completely clean and significantly wealthier. I slowly pulled my hand away from my cell phone. I could absolutely not allow that to happen. DeAndre was going to have to face the severe, devastating consequences of his own foolish criminal actions, but I was absolutely not going to let Brittany escape the massive fire she had intentionally started. I needed to completely, absolutely destroy her. I needed to systematically dismantle her fake luxury empire, expose her massive financial lies, and ensure that when the federal agents finally arrived, they would be putting the shiny silver handcuffs directly on her wrists as well. To achieve that level of total absolute destruction, I could not act impulsively. I had to completely suppress my anger and intentionally play the long game. I had to let them genuinely believe they were winning, while I meticulously built an airtight federal case against both of them. To successfully track a financial rat, you have to put out a very specific piece of highly appealing cheese. Brittany was incredibly greedy and completely desperate for liquid cash to fund her failing internet brand. She had aggressively demanded that I pay her $2,500 a month to quietly live in my own house. She arrogantly thought the rent demand was the ultimate humiliating power move. She thought it would firmly establish her absolute dominance over me. But to a forensic real estate appraiser, a monthly rent check is not a sign of submissive defeat. A rent check is a highly sensitive, deeply accurate financial tracking device. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out my personal leather checkbook. I grabbed my favorite blue ink pen and stared down at the blank paper. If I handed Brittany a physical check, she would have to digitally deposit it into a bank account. Once that specific check cleared my personal bank system, I would easily have the exact routing numbers and the hidden account numbers of the specific shell corporation she was using to hide the stolen home equity money. It was the absolute perfect, incredibly simple way to secretly map their entire fraudulent financial network without raising a single shred of suspicion. I carefully clicked my pen and began to write. I wrote out the current date with perfect, steady precision. I wrote Brittany's full legal name on the payee line, making absolutely sure every single letter was perfectly legible. In the small numerical box, I clearly wrote $2,500. I spelled the large amount out on the main line, my handwriting flowing smoothly across the crisp paper. On the small memo line, at the very bottom corner of the check, I wrote the words, "First month, rent." I did not let my hand shake even a fraction of an inch as I firmly signed my official signature at the bottom. It was the exact same signature DeAndre had foolishly chosen to forge on his fraudulent loan documents. I tore the check carefully from the leather booklet and held it up to the warm light of the desk lamp. It looked like a complete, absolute surrender. It looked like the pathetic, desperate action of a terrified, defeated old woman who was willing to completely empty her retirement savings just to avoid being thrown out onto the cold street. Brittany would take this check and she would laugh at my apparent weakness. She would proudly show it to DeAndre as absolute proof that her cruel, aggressive tactics had worked flawlessly. But they had absolutely no idea who they were actually dealing with. They had arrogantly provoked a woman who spent her entire life tracking down missing money and destroying arrogant fraudsters. I slowly placed the written check right in the center of my desk, next to the heavy, irrevocable trust folder. A deep, profound sense of calm settled completely over my mind. I was absolutely ready for the war they had started. Tomorrow morning, I would hand my daughter-in-law this piece of paper and actively begin the meticulous process of entirely dismantling her pathetic life. The trap was perfectly set, and the fake luxury queen was about to eagerly step right into it. The morning sun had barely begun to filter through the heavy velvet curtains of my study when the loud, aggressive pounding started at my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was a rapid, furious hammering that echoed loudly through the silent house. I already knew exactly who was standing on the other side of that heavy oak door. It was my 30-year-old daughter, Maya. Maya is a brilliant, hard-working paralegal at a top corporate law firm downtown, but she has always been the designated scapegoat of this family. While DeAndre was constantly praised and coddled simply for existing, Maya had to fight tooth and nail for every single ounce of respect she ever received. She heard about the disastrous birthday dinner from one of my church friends who had fled the dining room the night before. I walked down the long wooden staircase and unlocked the front door. Maya burst into the foyer like a completely unhinged hurricane. Her dark eyes were blazing with a terrifying, fiery rage, and her hands were curled into tight, aggressive fists. She did not even say hello. She just looked around the empty hallway, breathing heavily, and demanded to know exactly where DeAndre and his pathetic excuse for a wife were hiding. She was fully prepared to march right up the stairs, drag Brittany out of her expensive designer bed by her hair, and physically throw her out onto the front lawn. She was absolutely furious that her own brother would dare to hand their mother an eviction notice. I completely understood her profound anger, but I could absolutely not let her derail my meticulous legal strategy. I quickly grabbed Maya by her shoulders and used my own physical weight to block her from walking toward the staircase. I looked deeply into her angry eyes and firmly told her to stop immediately. I told her that physical violence and loud screaming would absolutely not solve this massive problem. Brittany desperately wanted us to act like out-of-control angry women so she could easily call the police and play the role of the innocent, terrified victim. I explained to Maya that if she went upstairs and started a physical altercation, she would lose her paralegal license and end up in a jail cell. I absolutely refused to let that greedy little girl ruin my daughter's bright legal career. Maya stared at me, her chest heaving with heavy, angry breaths, but she slowly unclenched her tight fists. She trusted me completely. I took her gently by the hand and led her away from the staircase, walking her directly into the absolute quiet safety of my private home study. I firmly shut the heavy oak door and locked it, ensuring that DeAndre and Brittany could not possibly hear a single word of our highly confidential conversation. Once we were safely secured inside the study, I walked over to my large mahogany desk and picked up the thick, heavy folder containing my estate documents. I handed the irrevocable trust paperwork directly to Maya and watched as her sharp paralegal instincts instantly took over. She sat down in the leather guest chair and began to rapidly read through the dense legal jargon. I stood by the window and quietly explained the entire devastating situation to her. I told her about the forged home equity line of credit, the massive bank fraud, and my personal signature that DeAndre had maliciously completely faked to secure the funds. I watched the profound shock and deep sorrow wash over my daughter's face as she finally realized that her own brother was a massive federal criminal. But Maya is incredibly strong. The sadness in her eyes quickly hardened into a cold, calculating determination that perfectly mirrored my own professional mindset. She looked up from the thick legal folder and asked me why I had not simply called the federal authorities the night before. She knew exactly how serious these specific financial crimes were, and she knew DeAndre belonged in a federal prison cell for what he had done to me. I walked back to the desk and showed her the written rent check I had prepared for Brittany. I carefully explained my long-term strategic plan to entirely dismantle Brittany's fake luxury empire. I told Maya that if we simply called the police today, DeAndre would take the entire absolute fall for the massive bank fraud, while his manipulative wife quietly disappeared with hundreds of thousands of dollars of my stolen home equity. I absolutely needed to track the stolen money map, their entire fraudulent financial network, and completely guarantee that Brittany would be wearing shiny silver handcuffs right next to her pathetic, spineless husband. I needed a very smart, highly capable partner to help me quietly investigate their digital footprint without raising a single shred of suspicion. I looked directly at Maya and asked her if she was fully willing to join me in this dangerous secret alliance. Maya did not hesitate for a single second. She placed the irrevocable trust folder neatly on the desk, leaned forward, and offered me a brilliant, chilling smile. She told me she was absolutely ready to completely destroy them both. We immediately got to work right there in the quiet safety of my private study. Maya opened her encrypted laptop and securely connected to her law firm's advanced legal databases. Because she was a senior paralegal, she had authorized access to comprehensive background check systems, property public records, and highly detailed corporate registry databases. I gave her the exact routing number from a previous small transaction Brittany had made and told her to follow the digital money trail. For the next 3 hours, the only sounds in the study were the rapid clicking of Maya's keyboard and the soft hum of the computer fan. I sat quietly in my leather chair, organizing my own physical real estate files and preparing the necessary legal documentation we would eventually hand over to the federal prosecutor. I watched my beautiful, brilliant daughter work with absolute flawless precision. For years, she had been completely marginalized by her arrogant brother, and now she was the exact person meticulously building the ironclad criminal case that would permanently end his fake wealthy lifestyle. Around noon, Maya suddenly stopped typing. She let out a long, slow breath and stared intensely at her glowing computer screen. A look of total, absolute disbelief completely washed over her face. She slowly turned the laptop around and pushed it across the mahogany desk so I could clearly see the detailed financial reports she had just successfully uncovered. I leaned forward and began to read the dense pages of digital information. The massive, terrifying truth about Brittany's luxury lifestyle brand was finally completely exposed in plain, undeniable black and white text. Brittany was absolutely entirely broke. Her entire internet brand was nothing but a massive, elaborate financial scam. The detailed corporate records showed that she had zero actual physical inventory, zero legitimate retail partnerships, and absolutely no real paying customers. The hundreds of thousands of dollars DeAndre had illegally stolen from my home equity had not been invested into a growing corporate business. The stolen money was being rapidly drained to pay for fake social media followers, expensive leased luxury cars, and incredibly high-end designer clothes that she simply wore for internet pictures. They were burning through my stolen cash at a terrifying, unsustainable rate. But the absolute most shocking revelation was completely buried at the very bottom of the extensive background report. Maya pointed her perfectly manicured finger at a highly obscure public court record from a different county. It was a finalized residential eviction notice. It did not belong to Brittany or DeAndre. The formal eviction notice was officially issued to Susan Sterling. Susan is Brittany's 58-year-old mother. She is a deeply condescending, arrogant woman who has always treated me with profound, blatant racial disrespect. According to the official court document, Susan had just been legally evicted from her expensive high-rise luxury apartment completely due to massive unpaid rent and severe chronic gambling debts. She was entirely, completely bankrupt and had absolutely nowhere left to go. Maya looked up at me, her dark eyes wide with sudden terrifying realization. She told me that Brittany was not just extorting me for rent money to fund a fake internet lifestyle. Brittany was aggressively trying to completely force me out of my own beautiful home so she could secretly move her bankrupt racist mother right into my master bedroom. The sheer evil of their master plan finally completely crystallized in my mind. They were not just trying to aggressively steal my financial equity today. They were actively trying to entirely erase my physical presence from the massive property I had worked my entire life to build. I carefully closed Maya's laptop. I stood up from my heavy mahogany desk. The trap was fully set. I was absolutely ready for war. The bright Sunday morning sun shone warmly on the quiet, manicured streets of my upscale neighborhood. I had just finished attending a beautiful, uplifting service at my local church. I was wearing my absolute favorite Sunday best, which was a tailored, deep plum suit with a matching wide-brimmed hat and perfectly polished black leather pumps. The choir had sung magnificently, and the pastor had delivered an incredibly powerful sermon about the profound virtue of divine patience and the absolute necessity of maintaining a peaceful spirit during times of extreme hardship. It was a message I desperately needed to hear. I felt spiritually renewed and mentally prepared for the long, difficult legal battle that was rapidly approaching. I drove my pristine luxury sedan slowly up my paved driveway and parked exactly in my usual spot near the massive blooming oak tree. I took a deep, calming breath and gathered my leather purse completely ready to step back inside my beautiful home and continue my meticulous secret investigation. I walked up the wide brick pathway, listening to the cheerful chirping of the morning birds and feeling the gentle, warm breeze against my face. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But the moment I stepped onto my wide wrap around front porch, the quiet, peaceful illusion of my Sunday morning was instantly shattered. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out my heavy brass keychain. I walked up to the solid oak front door, the exact same door I had proudly unlocked daily. I slid my familiar brass key directly into the primary deadbolt lock and firmly turned my wrist, expecting to hear the satisfying, heavy click of the internal metal tumbling open. But the key did absolutely nothing. It slid into the slot easily enough, but it would not turn even a single fraction of an inch in either direction. I frowned slightly, thinking perhaps the heavy door had simply warped a little bit in the warm morning heat. I pulled the key out, completely wiped the smooth metal on my thumb, and carefully reinserted it into the lock. I pushed my physical weight against the thick wood and tried to turn the key again. It was completely, entirely stuck. I pulled the key out and looked closely at the shiny metal surface of the new deadbolt lock. My heart immediately sank deep into my stomach as my sharp appraiser eyes noticed the tiny, subtle differences. The brass lock plate was entirely brand new. It was completely free of the tiny, microscopic scratches and daily wear marks that my original lock had accumulated over the long years. The shiny screws holding the heavy metal plate in place were perfectly pristine and completely untarnished. Someone had aggressively changed the primary locks on my front door while I was peacefully sitting in church praising the Lord. Before I could even fully process the massive, incredibly disrespectful violation of my personal property, I heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps approaching me very quickly now. The footsteps came directly from the other side of the thick oak door. The brand new deadbolt clicked loudly, and the heavy door slowly swung open just a few short inches. It did not open wide enough to welcome me inside. It was strictly secured by a heavy new brass chain guard stretching tightly across the narrow gap. Peeking through the small opening with an incredibly smug and absolutely malicious grin on her pale face was my greedy 32-year-old daughter-in-law, Brittany. She was wearing a completely ridiculous expensive silk robe and holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee, looking entirely too comfortable inside my house. "Hello there, Yvonne," Brittany said, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet fake innocence that made my blood boil completely hot. "Did you have a nice long spiritual time at your little church this morning?" I stood on the porch in my tailored plum suit, maintaining my perfect elegant posture and looking directly into her cold, empty eyes. Why exactly is my key completely failing to open my own front door? "Brittany," I asked, my voice remaining incredibly calm and totally even. Despite the raging fire of anger burning deep inside my chest, I demanded to know exactly why she had illegally hired a professional locksmith to aggressively tamper with the primary security of my massive residential property without my explicit permission right now on this completely beautiful, bright Sunday morning, before any more foolish actions were completely taken today. Brittany let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed harshly through the narrow crack in the door. "Oh, Yvonne, you are just so incredibly stubborn," she mocked loudly, taking a slow sip of her expensive coffee. "You really need to start actively paying much closer attention to the brand new modern rules around here." DeAndre and I had a very long, serious business discussion late last night. We completely decided that since you are officially just a paying monthly tenant, now it is totally inappropriate for you to casually live inside the primary main house with the actual wealthy property owners. We highly value our strict personal privacy, and my luxury lifestyle brand requires complete, absolute exclusivity. Therefore, we are officially moving you out of the main estate immediately. She casually gestured her hand toward the far end of the wide brick porch. I slowly turned my head and looked exactly where she was pointing. Sitting entirely abandoned on the cold, hard brick floor were two of my large vintage leather suitcases. They were completely packed and aggressively zipped shut. My beautiful clothes, my personal daily toiletries, and my intimate private belongings had been roughly hastily shoved into those bags by her greedy manicured hands while I was completely gone. She had physically violated my private master bedroom, aggressively rifled through my personal private sanctuary, and casually thrown my entire life into a couple of bags like I was absolutely nothing but common unwanted trash today on my own property. Brittany leaned her face closer to the narrow opening gap, her eyes shining with pure malicious cruelty. "From now on, Yvonne, you are only strictly legally permitted to live inside the small detached guest house in the backyard," she announced, her voice loud and incredibly authoritative. "The guest house is perfectly adequate for a single retired old woman like you. It has a tiny little kitchen and a very small basic bathroom. You are absolutely entirely banned from entering the primary main house ever again without my explicit direct permission. If you desperately need something, you will respectfully knock on the back door and wait quietly until I decide to answer you. And just to be completely clear, your massive, ridiculous monthly rent of $2,500 remains exactly the same. You are paying for the supreme luxury of simply residing on my exclusive high-end property. Do you completely, entirely understand these new mandatory living arrangements, Yvonne? Or do I need to slowly write them down for your aging brain to fully comprehend?" The sheer, unadulterated disrespect and profound arrogance radiating from her pale face was utterly astounding. She genuinely, completely believed she had just delivered the ultimate crushing blow to my personal dignity and my absolute pride. She fully expected me to finally completely break down right there on the front porch in my beautiful Sunday church clothes. She wanted me to start screaming loudly and violently, banging my fists against the thick front door today. She wanted to record my emotional breakdown to completely justify her incredibly cruel, illegal actions. But I absolutely refused to give that arrogant little girl the tiny satisfaction of seeing me sweat. I completely remembered the incredibly powerful sermon from church about divine patience and absolute restraint. I also clearly remembered the massive, thick folder labeled Irrevocable Trust safely hidden inside my private study safe, which she had absolutely failed to aggressively locate during her illegal packing spree. I slowly turned my eyes away from her smug, pale face and looked peacefully out over my beautifully manicured front lawn. I took a very slow, incredibly deep breath, completely, perfectly centering my strong internal spirit. I did not shed a single tiny tear. I looked directly back into Brittany's cold, expectant eyes and offered her a very soft, completely gentle, submissive smile. "I entirely understand the new rules, Brittany," I said, my voice sounding completely defeated and incredibly small. "I will absolutely gather my heavy bags and immediately move quietly out to the small back guest house right now." The bright, smug smile on her face immediately grew twice as large. She aggressively slammed the heavy oak door completely shut in my face. I stood entirely alone on the front porch for a long, quiet moment. Then I slowly walked over to my packed leather suitcases, picked them up by their heavy handles, and began the slow, quiet walk toward the backyard guest house today, knowing my secret plan worked perfectly. The next morning I woke up early inside the small, detached guest house, nestled quietly in the back corner of my own expansive backyard. I brewed a fresh cup of black coffee and stood by the small kitchen window, looking out over the beautifully manicured green lawn toward the massive primary estate that I had paid for with my own money. The peaceful silence of the early morning was suddenly interrupted by the grinding gears and squealing brakes of a cheap rented moving van pulling into my pristine paved driveway. I watched as the heavy driver's side door swung open and a 58-year-old woman stepped out onto the driveway. It was Susan Sterling. She is Brittany's incredibly arrogant, deeply condescending mother, thanks to Maya's brilliant paralegal background check. I already knew the pathetic truth about Susan. I knew she had just been legally evicted from her luxury high-rise apartment across town because of her massive chronic gambling debts and her financial bankruptcy, but looking at her, stepping out of that cheap rented moving van, you would never possibly guess that she was entirely broke. Susan was wearing an expensive-looking beige cashmere sweater, an oversized pair of designer sunglasses, and holding a tiny purebred lapdog tightly against her chest. She strutted confidently up the brick pathway, completely acting as if she were a wealthy, descending queen, graciously arriving to claim her brand-new royal palace. She did not look like a desperate homeless woman begging her daughter for a free place to stay. She looked exactly like a greedy predator who had finally found the perfect, unsuspecting host to completely drain dry. I remained hidden behind the thin curtains of the guest house, watching the entire infuriating spectacle unfold right in front of my eyes. Brittany and DeAndre rushed out of the heavy oak front door to eagerly greet her. DeAndre, my own flesh and blood, immediately began carrying Susan's heavy cardboard boxes out of the moving van and hauling them directly. Inside the main house, I watched his broad shoulders strain under the weight of her belongings, disgusted by his pathetic subservience. But the worst moment came when I realized exactly where they were taking her personal things. Through the large second-story windows, I could see DeAndre's silhouette moving back and forth. They were moving Susan directly into my massive master bedroom. They were placing her cheap luggage onto my custom-built mahogany bed frame and filling my spacious walk-in closets with her clothes. The sheer disrespect made my stomach churn with a violent, sickening intensity. They had locked me out of my own house, forced me to live in a tiny, cramped backyard shed, and gifted my beautiful private sanctuary to a racist, bankrupt gambling addict who had never worked a single honest day in her entire pathetic life. I took a slow, incredibly deep breath, forcing my rising anger back down into the dark, locked vault inside my mind. I could not afford to lose my perfect composure today, decided I needed to get some fresh air to clear my mind and maintain my physical boundaries. I stepped out of the guest house and walked slowly toward my beautiful, vibrant flower garden near the side of the main paved driveway. As I was gently pruning my blooming rose bushes, I heard the heavy front door swing open again. I stood up straight and looked over the tall green hedges. Susan was marching down the front porch steps, carrying a large, heavy object in her thin arms. My heart stopped beating for a brief, terrifying second when I finally recognized exactly what she was holding. It was my beautiful, priceless collection of traditional African American artwork. I had spent decades curating those specific historical paintings and hand-carved wooden sculptures. They were deeply significant cultural pieces that celebrated my rich heritage and the profound, beautiful history of my resilient ancestors. I watched in frozen horror as Susan walked directly over to the massive plastic garbage bin sitting on the edge of the driveway. She did not even hesitate for a single second. She casually lifted my beautiful framed historical paintings and tossed them right into the dirty trash can like they were nothing but worthless garbage. I immediately dropped my gardening shears onto the soft grass and walked purposefully out from behind the tall green hedges. I marched directly across the paved driveway, stopping just a few short feet away from where she was standing next to the trash bin. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Susan?" I asked, my voice remaining incredibly low and perfectly steady, despite the massive raging fire of absolute pure fury burning deep inside my soul. Susan slowly turned around to face me, completely unfazed by my sudden physical presence. She looked me up and down, analyzing my simple gardening clothes through her dark, designer sunglasses with a look of extreme, profound disgust. She let out a loud, arrogant, mocking laugh that echoed harshly against the quiet morning air. "Hello, Yvonne," Susan said, her voice completely dripping with toxic racist condescension and absolute total arrogance. "I'm simply cleaning up the massive aesthetic mess inside the primary estate. Brittany has an incredibly specific luxury vision for her brand new house, and this cheap ghetto artwork absolutely does not fit the high-end modern profile she is aggressively trying to cultivate today. It completely ruins the elegant energy of the main living room. So I am simply doing her a massive favor and throwing this dark, depressing garbage completely away." I looked directly down into the large plastic garbage bin and saw my beautiful, expensive historical paintings resting harshly against empty coffee cups and dirty cardboard boxes. The blatant, horrible microaggressions and the casual, deeply ingrained racism rolling right off her tongue were completely nauseating. She was standing on the exact property I had completely paid for, aggressively throwing away my deeply cherished cultural heritage and confidently calling it cheap ghetto garbage to my actual face. I slowly lifted my chin and looked directly into her cold, greedy eyes, maintaining my absolute perfect, elegant posture. "Those specific paintings are incredibly rare and absolutely priceless. Susan," I said, keeping my tone completely even and strictly professional, "you have absolutely no legal or moral right to touch my personal private belongings, let alone throw them into a dirty trash can outside my own home today." Susan aggressively crossed her thin arms tightly over her beige cashmere sweater and took a bold, incredibly hostile step directly toward me. She completely invaded my personal physical space, trying desperately to intimidate me with her false, unearned sense of supreme, wealthy superiority. "You really need to learn how to properly respect your absolute betters, Yvonne," Susan sneered, her voice dropping into a harsh, vicious whisper. "You need to finally accept the harsh, permanent reality of your new pathetic situation. You are completely, entirely nothing now. You are just a lonely, sad old woman renting a tiny little shed in the backyard of my daughter's massive, beautiful estate. Brittany finally married into some real, significant money, and she is officially the wealthy lady of this massive manor. DeAndre knows exactly who is completely in charge, and he is aggressively making sure my daughter gets absolutely everything she rightfully deserves. We are the new permanent masters of this incredible property now, and you are incredibly lucky. We do not just throw you completely out onto the cold, hard street today, where you truly belong. Do not ever dare to question my personal interior design choices or my absolute unquestionable authority on this property ever again." Susan proudly turned her back on me and confidently strutted back up the brick pathway, completely expecting me to dramatically fall apart and cry over my ruined, expensive artwork. She genuinely believed her incredibly racist, arrogant bullying had entirely, completely destroyed my spirit. She truly thought she had completely established her absolute total dominance over me today on this sunny morning. She fully believed she had safely escaped her massive gambling debts and her humiliating legal eviction by secretly moving directly into a beautiful, permanent, wealthy mansion. I stood entirely alone on the paved driveway, and I did not shed a single tiny tear. I simply looked at her rapidly retreating back and allowed a very slow, completely chilling smile to easily spread entirely across my face. Susan had just proudly unpacked her cheap luggage bags and hung her expensive stolen clothes inside my beautiful master bedroom. She had absolutely no idea that my brilliant daughter Maya was currently handing massive, undeniable evidence of severe federal bank fraud directly over to the authorities. Susan was confidently unpacking her bags inside a house that was about to become a massive, active federal crime scene. Let her proudly enjoy the completely stolen master bedroom tonight, because the total, absolute destruction of her entire fake family was coming very soon. The bright morning sun cast long, heavy shadows across the small, cramped backyard guest house. I was now officially forced to call my permanent home. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the narrow, uncomfortable mattress, staring directly at the small piece of crisp, rectangular paper resting quietly in my lap. It was the physical bank check I had carefully written out for $2,500 the night before, inside my beautiful private study. This small piece of paper was the ultimate, absolute key to completely destroying my arrogant daughter-in-law, Brittany, and my deeply spineless son, DeAndre. I took a very slow, incredibly deep breath, completely centering my mind and actively preparing my physical body for the massive performance I was about to deliver. I had spent my entire 30-year professional career as a highly successful commercial real estate appraiser, absolutely refusing to ever show a single ounce of weakness or vulnerability to anyone. I was a strong, fiercely independent woman who had built a massive financial empire completely from scratch. But today, on this warm, sunny morning, I had to intentionally, completely strip away every single layer of my natural pride. I had to actively become the exact, pathetic, broken victim Brittany so desperately wanted to see. I had to make her genuinely believe she had completely, entirely defeated me, so she would blindly step right into the massive federal trap Maya and I had meticulously set for her. I slowly stood up from the small bed and smoothed the wrinkles out of my plain, simple gray cotton dress. I intentionally left my hair slightly unkempt, and I completely avoided putting on any of my usual elegant makeup. I needed to look incredibly tired, entirely defeated, and completely overwhelmed by the massive, stressful situation. I picked up the written rent check and folded it carefully, holding it tightly in my right hand. I opened the thin wooden door of the guest house and stepped out into the bright, warm sunlight. The walk across my own beautiful, expansive backyard felt like a slow, agonizing march across a massive foreign battlefield. I looked at the incredible, pristine landscaping I had personally designed and paid for over the last 2 decades. The lush green grass and the tall, blooming oak trees stood in stark, silent contrast to the dark, terrible betrayal happening inside the main primary estate. I slowly approached the heavy glass back door of the massive house, completely remembering the incredibly cruel, strict rules Brittany had loudly established just yesterday. She had explicitly banned me from ever casually using my own front door and aggressively demanded that I respectfully knock on the back entrance like a common, unwanted servant. I stepped up onto the smooth concrete back patio and raised my hand, my heart beating with a slow, rhythmic precision. I knocked 3 times on the thick glass pane, keeping my knocks intentionally soft and incredibly hesitant. I stood there on the patio, looking down at my plain, sensible shoes, completely adopting the physical posture of a thoroughly beaten, submissive woman. I waited patiently in the warm sun, completely ignoring the deep, raging fire of absolute righteous fury burning fiercely inside my chest. It took her several long, humiliating minutes to finally answer the door. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly, and the glass door swung open to reveal Brittany standing there in another ridiculously expensive designer outfit. She was wearing a pristine white silk blouse and heavy gold jewelry, holding her expensive smartphone tightly in her left hand. She looked down at me through the thick glass doorway, her pale face twisting into a mask of pure supreme arrogance and incredibly toxic condescension. "Yes, Yvonne," she snapped, her voice incredibly harsh and completely devoid of any basic human empathy. "What exactly do you want this morning?" "I am incredibly busy managing my luxury lifestyle brand, and I do not have the free time to deal with your endless emotional complaints today." I kept my head bowed slightly, looking up at her with wide, terrified eyes. I let my shoulders slump forward completely, mimicking the physical appearance of a deeply broken, frightened elderly woman. "I am so incredibly sorry to bother you this morning, Brittany," I said, my voice intentionally shaking and sounding incredibly small and pathetic. "I know you and DeAndre are both very busy building your massive corporate empire, and I absolutely do not want to cause any more trouble or unnecessary tension in the family. I just wanted to come over here and formally apologize for my stubborn behavior over the last few days. I was just so completely shocked and entirely overwhelmed by all the sudden massive changes. But I finally fully understand exactly how things have to be. Now." I slowly reached out my trembling right hand and offered her the folded paper check. "I brought you the rent money you asked for." "Brittany," I said, forcing a single thick, fake tear to pool perfectly in the corner of my eye. "It is the full $2,500 for the first month. I just desperately need to know that I am still allowed to quietly live out here in the small guest house. Please, Brittany, do not throw me out onto the street. I have absolutely nowhere else to go, and I promise I will stay completely out of your way. I will not bother you or Susan or DeAndre ever again. I will just stay in the backyard and quietly pay my monthly rent. Please just let me stay here on the property." The sheer, unadulterated pleasure that rapidly spread across her pale, arrogant face was incredibly sickening to witness. She literally fed on my fake misery like a starving, greedy vampire. She genuinely, completely believed every single shaking word I had just spoken. She truly thought her aggressive bullying tactics and her mother's incredibly racist, cruel behavior had completely, entirely crushed my strong, independent spirit. Brittany let out a loud, sharp, mocking laugh and aggressively snatched the folded paper check right out of my trembling hand. She did not even offer a single word of basic thanks. She quickly unfolded the crisp paper and aggressively inspected my handwritten signature and the large numerical amount to completely ensure I had not tried to trick her. "Oh, Yvonne, you are finally starting to learn exactly how the real modern world actually works," she sneered, her eyes shining with pure, malicious greed. "I am incredibly glad you finally completely gave up your ridiculous, stubborn pride. It is honestly quite pathetic to see a grown woman completely begging on my back patio. But I suppose I can graciously allow you to continue renting the tiny, dirty shed in the backyard as long as this massive check completely clears the bank today." She did not even wait to step back inside the main house to secure the funds. She was entirely too greedy and completely desperate for the liquid cash to fund her fake internet lifestyle. She immediately raised her expensive smartphone and quickly opened her private mobile banking application right there on the back patio, right in front of my face. I stood perfectly still, watching carefully as she aggressively tapped the screen, navigating directly to the mobile check deposit feature. She proudly held the phone over the written check and quickly snapped a digital picture of the front and the back, seamlessly depositing my personal funds directly into her completely hidden, fraudulent bank account. The digital transaction was entirely instantaneous. The mobile app chimed loudly, confirming the massive financial transfer was completely successful. She smiled a cold, dark, arrogant smile and shoved the crisp paper check deeply into the pocket of her expensive white silk trousers. Just remember your absolute place from now on. Yvonne, she whispered harshly, leaning slightly through the open doorway. You are nothing but a common paying tenant now. Do not ever forget who entirely owns this massive estate. She violently slammed the heavy glass door completely shut in my face, the loud sound echoing sharply across the quiet backyard patio. I stood completely alone on the concrete patio for several long, silent moments, staring blankly at the thick, closed glass door. I waited until I could no longer see her blurry silhouette moving around inside the massive, expensive kitchen. The very second she was completely gone from my sight, my slumped shoulders instantly straightened, my terrified wide eyes narrowed into a cold, sharp, dangerous glare, and the fake submissive trembling completely permanently vanished from my physical body. The pathetic, defeated victim was instantly entirely gone, replaced by the brilliant, calculating forensic real estate appraiser. I turned my back on the massive primary house and walked slowly, confidently back across the lush green lawn toward the small, detached guest house. My mind was racing with incredible, absolute clarity. The trap had just been perfectly, flawlessly sprung. Brittany was so completely blinded by her massive, unearned arrogance and her intense, desperate greed that she had absolutely no idea she had just made the single biggest catastrophic mistake of her entire pathetic life. She thought she was aggressively stealing my hard-earned retirement money to buy fake social media followers and expensive designer clothes. She had absolutely no clue that I had specifically given her that physical check for the exact sole purpose of securely mapping her entire hidden financial network. I walked directly into the quiet guest house and calmly closed the thin wooden door behind me. I walked over to the small kitchen counter and picked up my own cell phone. The bright screen was already glowing with an urgent automated notification from my secure personal banking institution. The massive digital alert confirmed that a check for $2,500 had just been successfully electronically processed and entirely cleared from my primary checking account. I quickly unlocked my phone and immediately opened my secure text messaging application. I typed in Maya's private phone number and began to rapidly compose my incredibly important message. The mobile deposit was completely successful. I typed my fingers moving with rapid, flawless precision across the digital keyboard. The funds have officially just cleared my primary account. Check your secure legal financial portals right now. The digital tracking code is fully active within the banking system. I hit the send button and stared intensely at the bright screen, waiting for my brilliant daughter to complete the final massive step of our secret investigation. I did not have to wait very long. Less than 2 entire minutes later, my phone buzzed violently in my hand with a direct reply from Maya. I opened the message and read the beautiful, undeniable text. My heart beat with a slow, incredibly powerful rhythm of absolute, pure, righteous justice. We got her. Mom, Maya wrote her text practically radiating with cold legal triumph. The digital transaction completely exposed the entire hidden route. We now officially have the exact direct routing numbers and the specific private account numbers for Brittany's totally fraudulent hidden shell corporation. The account is officially registered under a fake luxury business name, but the primary federal tax identification number perfectly matches DeAndre's stolen home equity loan documents. We have the entire massive financial paper trail officially perfectly secured. I slowly lowered the cell phone and allowed a wide, chilling, serene smile to completely spread across my entire face. I had successfully played the pathetic, defeated victim to absolute perfection, and the arrogant, fake luxury queen had eagerly swallowed the poisoned bait completely whole. The massive, undeniable federal evidence was now entirely permanently locked inside our complete possession. I walked over to the small window of the tiny guest house and looked back out at the massive, beautiful estate that I had completely paid for with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I thought about Susan sleeping comfortably inside my custom master bedroom, and DeAndre foolishly believing he was a massive, successful corporate king. I thought about Brittany's incredibly smug face as she aggressively snatched the check from my hands, completely convinced she had entirely won the massive family war. They were all living inside a beautiful, delicate glass house, entirely funded by severe federal bank fraud and stolen equity. They were incredibly comfortable and completely deeply arrogant, but they were absolutely entirely surrounded by invisible federal traps that Maya and I were meticulously actively setting all around them. I sat back down on the edge of the narrow, uncomfortable guest bed, holding my cell phone tightly in my hands. We now had the exact, precise routing numbers, the hidden corporate account details, and the undeniable digital proof of their massive ongoing financial extortion. Maya was already quietly, securely compiling the extensive legal files she would eventually hand directly over to the federal prosecutor from the Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Unit Brittany. Absolutely thought she was completely untouchable simply because she had bullied an old woman into paying monthly rent. She thought her fake luxury brand and her expensive designer clothes made her entirely immune to the harsh, strict realities of the actual legal system. She was about to learn a very hard, incredibly devastating lesson about exactly what happens when you foolishly decide to aggressively steal from a highly trained forensic real estate appraiser. I closed my eyes and took another slow, deep, calming breath, feeling entirely at peace with the massive incoming destruction. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or maternal guilt for any of them anymore. They had completely, ruthlessly crossed every single moral and legal boundary known to mankind, and they absolutely entirely deserved the massive, incredibly explosive federal punishment that was currently rapidly heading directly straight toward their heavily locked front door. The heavy sun finally set below the tall green hedges, leaving the small, cramped guest house bathed in thick, suffocating darkness. Maya arrived just after midnight, sneaking quietly across the back lawn to avoid triggering the expensive motion sensor lights Brittany had recently installed on the main property. She carried her heavy black leather briefcase and her encrypted law firm laptop. My beautiful, brilliant daughter slipped through the thin wooden door and locked it securely behind her. We did not turn on the main overhead lights because we absolutely could not afford to let anyone inside the primary estate know we were awake. We sat closely together at the tiny circular kitchen table, illuminated entirely by the harsh, cold blue glow of Maya's computer screen. The digital routing numbers we successfully acquired from that single rent check were the perfect key unlocking the heavy doors of Brittany's fraudulent financial network. Maya typed furiously, her fingers flying across the quiet keyboard with incredible, absolute precision. She accessed highly secure legal financial databases and seamlessly cross-referenced the hidden corporate shell account with National Property Registry archives. The massive, terrifying truth began to slowly materialize on the bright digital screen line by devastating line. I leaned forward, my forensic real estate appraiser instincts completely taking over my mind. We traced the initial massive deposit back to its absolute original source, and my heart stopped completely inside my chest. DeAndre and Brittany had not just taken out a small, modest business loan to buy some cheap internet inventory. They had actively, aggressively leveraged my entire life savings. They had successfully executed a fraudulent home equity line of credit for a staggering $500,000 against my fully paid-off massive property. $500,000 entirely stolen with a single forged signature. The sheer absolute magnitude of the massive federal bank fraud was genuinely sickening. DeAndre had literally handed over $500,000 of my hard-earned pure equity directly to a woman who had absolutely no legitimate business experience. Maya clicked on the detailed transaction history of the Hidden Shell Corporation, expecting to find invoices for luxury inventory or receipts for expensive commercial warehouse space. Instead, we found a completely massive, chaotic black hole of incredibly pathetic personal spending. The money was entirely completely gone. There were absolutely no legitimate corporate business expenses on the entire digital ledger. The fake luxury lifestyle brand was nothing but a completely hollow, expensive digital facade to hide their massive, endless greed. We followed the digital money trail downward, watching the $500,000 rapidly vanish into incredibly absurd, deeply pathetic purchases over the last few short, frantic months, leaving them entirely broke. First, we easily uncovered exactly how Susan was magically able to afford her expensive designer cashmere sweaters and her pristine, tiny, purebred lapdog. Brittany had immediately wired an astonishing $80,000 directly to various shady debt collection agencies and high-stakes underground casinos. The money was aggressively used to completely pay off Susan's massive chronic gambling debts, completely saving her racist, condescending mother from facing severe legal consequences and total absolute bankruptcy. My son had illegally forged my legal signature and actively stolen my deeply cherished home equity simply to rescue a deeply toxic bankrupt woman who casually threw my priceless traditional African American historical artwork directly into a dirty plastic garbage bin. The profound, sickening betrayal burned incredibly hot deep inside my chest, but I forced myself to remain completely calm and entirely strictly focused on the glowing digital computer screen, waiting silently inside the very dark room. The rest of the massive stolen funds were aggressively funneled directly into incredibly pathetic digital vanity projects. Brittany had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars aggressively purchasing fake social media followers, fake internet engagement statistics, and completely fraudulent digital marketing campaigns. She bought empty likes and artificial comments to make her fake lifestyle brand appear incredibly popular and vastly wealthy to the unsuspecting outside world. She leased expensive luxury vehicles she could never actually afford, and booked incredibly expensive private catering services for lavish fake launch parties just to desperately impress people who absolutely did not care about her. The digital ledger was entirely empty. They had burned through $500,000 of my stolen equity in a matter of weeks, buying absolutely nothing but fake internet clout and temporary luxurious illusions. They were completely broke right now, sitting inside my beautiful, expensive stolen house without cash. Maya scrolled down to the very bottom of the massive, detailed financial document and pointed her manicured finger at a highly critical, upcoming scheduled bank transfer. The cold, hard reality of their completely reckless financial behavior was about to aggressively crash directly down onto their arrogant heads. The massive fraudulent home equity line of credit required a strict, substantial monthly repayment. My forensic real estate appraiser background allowed me to instantly calculate the massive, severe financial burden they had blindly accepted. The very first massive loan repayment of exactly $10,000 was officially due in exactly 3 short days. They had absolutely zero remaining liquid cash inside their hidden corporate shell account, and their fake luxury internet brand generated absolutely zero real revenue. They were entirely trapped in a massive financial corner with absolutely no legitimate legal way out of the terrible, severe mess they quickly created today. I sat back in my uncomfortable wooden chair, completely staring at the glowing blue computer screen. A dark, terrifying question began to rapidly formulate deep inside my analytical mind. If they are completely broke, and they know the massive $10,000 bank payment is officially due in 3 short days, why are they acting so incredibly arrogant and supremely wealthy? Why is Brittany aggressively planning a massive, expensive catered launch party for this coming Saturday night and proudly parading her racist mother around my beautiful master bedroom? Desperate people who are completely out of money typically panic violently, but Brittany was acting exactly like a woman who confidently knew a massive incoming windfall was officially entirely guaranteed. I closed my eyes and completely actively engaged every single decade of my professional commercial real estate experience, carefully analyzing their deeply chaotic behavior, trying to find the missing logical piece. The terrifying absolute truth suddenly hit me with the incredible massive force of a speeding freight train. It was a classic aggressive illegal real estate maneuver I had personally witnessed dozens of corrupt, greedy developers attempt over my long professional career. Brittany was absolutely not trying to build a legitimate long-term business, and she definitely was not planning to casually live inside my beautiful, massive estate for the rest of her natural life. She was aggressively planning to completely flip the entire stolen property. She knew the Federal Commercial Bank would immediately trigger a massive severe foreclosure process the very second they completely missed that first massive $10,000 payment. She needed to completely illegally liquidate the entire massive estate and securely hide the massive profits before the commercial bank auditors officially caught on to the massive severe fraudulent loan documents and the completely forged signature entirely today. I opened my eyes and looked directly at my brilliant, beautiful daughter. Maya, they are aggressively planning to illegally sell my entire house, I whispered, my voice completely cold and entirely steady. They took out the massive fraudulent loan to create a fake wealthy image to attract highly rich private investors to this massive upcoming weekend party. Brittany is going to aggressively pitch my beautiful entire property to a corrupt private real estate developer this Saturday night. She wants to illegally sell the massive estate completely off-market for a massive quick cash payout before the bank realizes the original home equity loan is entirely completely fraudulent. They will take the massive cash payment entirely, abandon the massive defaulted loan, and completely flee the state, leaving me totally permanently homeless and leaving the massive federal bank to aggressively completely repossess my entire beautiful empty property this very weekend without mercy. Maya stared at me, her dark eyes incredibly wide with complete absolute horror as the massive, terrible reality of their ultimate master plan fully settled into her brilliant legal mind. They are actively trying to completely, entirely erase your entire physical and financial existence. Mom, Maya whispered, her voice trembling with intense, pure, righteous fury. They are going to completely steal your entire massive life savings and quietly sell your beautiful home to a rich, corrupt developer right out from under you. We absolutely cannot let them get away with this massive, incredible evil. We have to immediately call the federal authorities right now tonight and have them completely aggressively arrested before they can illegally sign the fraudulent property transfer documents with the private developer this weekend. We have to completely stop them before they entirely permanently destroy everything you have aggressively built over the past 3 decades of life. The heavy darkness of the late night settled completely over the guest house, leaving me entirely alone with my rapidly racing thoughts. Maya had safely slipped out the back gate hours ago, taking her encrypted laptop and the devastating financial evidence with her. I lay awake on the narrow mattress, staring up at the white ceiling and listening to the quiet chirping of night insects outside my window. My analytical mind was running through the terrifying reality of what my son and his greedy wife had planned for my beautiful estate. They were preparing to illegally sell my home to a corrupt developer this Saturday to escape the massive $500,000 fraudulent bank loan they could no longer afford to pay. I was consumed by my strategic legal planning when a soft, hesitant knock suddenly echoed against the thin wooden door of the small guest house. I slowly sat up in the dark, swinging my legs over the edge of the small bed. I did not turn on the bedside lamp because I wanted to remain completely hidden in the shadows. I walked silently across the cramped room and peered carefully through the tiny glass window pane set into the door. Standing alone on the concrete porch, illuminated only by the pale silver moonlight, was my 35-year-old son, DeAndre. He was looking over his shoulder toward the massive, dark main house, checking to make absolutely sure his arrogant wife, Brittany, was still fast asleep inside my stolen master bedroom. I quietly unlocked the thin wooden door and slowly pulled it wide open, standing firmly in the dark entrance and looking directly into the incredibly tired, anxious face of my former golden child. DeAndre immediately stepped inside the dark guest house and pushed the heavy wooden door completely shut behind him. He looked absolutely terrible and entirely exhausted. The confident, arrogant demeanor he had proudly displayed during my completely ruined birthday dinner was entirely permanently gone. He was currently wearing deeply wrinkled dark sweatpants and a very loose gray cotton shirt, his broad shoulders slumped forward in a clear physical posture of complete pathetic defeat. He looked exactly like a highly frightened little boy who had just broken a highly valuable antique vase and was desperately hoping to easily avoid a severe strict punishment from his mother. He whispered my name quietly, his voice cracking with heavy manufactured false emotion. He stated he was incredibly sorry to aggressively bother me this incredibly late at night, but he desperately needed to talk to me alone without his wife listening. Before I could offer a single short word of normal response, DeAndre suddenly dropped heavily onto the small, faded fabric sofa sitting in the dark corner of the room and buried his face completely in his large hands. His broad, muscular shoulders began to violently shake, and he let out a loud, wretched, pathetic sob that sounded incredibly forced and highly theatrical. He was aggressively putting on a massive dramatic performance right there in my tiny, dark living room. He cried loudly, rubbing his eyes to actively produce a few pathetic small tears. He verbally stated exactly how incredibly sorry he was for absolutely everything that had recently happened. He explicitly stated that he knew exactly how incredibly cruel and deeply disrespectful Brittany had been to me over the last few highly stressful days. He claimed that the formal eviction notice and the massive monthly rent demand were entirely disrespectful and completely wrong. He swore that he never wanted any of this terrible conflict to happen between the two most incredibly important women in his entire life. I remained standing perfectly still near the small kitchen counter, completely maintaining my calm, safe physical distance from his fake emotional display. I absolutely did not rush forward to wrap my arms around him and blindly comfort him like a highly naive, deeply loving mother. My long professional background as a highly successful forensic commercial real estate appraiser had successfully taught me exactly how to properly read physical body language and aggressively spot a highly desperate manipulative liar from a mile away. I carefully watched his fake shaking shoulders and intently listened to his incredibly dramatic loud sobbing, and I felt absolutely nothing inside but a deep, profound, massive wave of pure maternal absolute disgust. He was absolutely not genuinely apologizing for illegally stealing my massive, expensive home equity or aggressively locking me entirely out of my own beautiful, massive house. He was completely actively playing the specific role of the completely helpless, sad victim to rapidly lower my strict emotional defenses and gain my total financial trust. I completely maintained my cold emotional distance and calmly replied to his dramatic tears. I stated that I completely knew things had been incredibly difficult lately, and I just simply wanted to live my daily life in absolute quiet peace without any more terrible family disruptions. I firmly asked him exactly what he truly, desperately wanted from me tonight. DeAndre slowly lifted his heavy head, wiping the fake, salty tears from his pale cheeks. He looked directly up at me with wide, deeply pleading eyes, completely rapidly abandoning his previous deeply arrogant stance. He stated that the primary massive issue was Brittany's failing luxury lifestyle business. He stammered nervously, his voice completely dripping with intense, desperate, pure anxiety. He claimed they had aggressively hit a massive, unexpected financial roadblock just this week. He explicitly confessed that they were entirely tapped out of all liquid available cash right now. DeAndre leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees, and looking directly at me with pure, desperate, intense greed, perfectly, flawlessly disguised as deep, filial desperation. He continued talking, his words flowing incredibly rapidly now that he was finally successfully arriving at his true, ultimate dark motive. He stated that he completely knew I had always been incredibly smart and highly conservative with my personal private finances over the decades. He stated that he completely knew I had fully paid off the massive main house years ago, and that I had spent 3 decades working as a highly successful commercial forensic appraiser. He claimed that I absolutely had to have some secret, hidden private retirement accounts or some highly secure private offshore mutual funds tucked securely, safely away for a rainy day. He stated that he just desperately needed to temporarily, quickly borrow $50,000 in pure liquid cash to completely smoothly resolve this minor temporary business cash flow issue. He aggressively swore to me on his actual life that he would absolutely completely pay me back every single tiny penny with massive high interest the very second the luxury brand officially successfully launches and their rich private investors fully fund the massive corporate expansion. I stood perfectly, incredibly still in the dark, quiet room, completely absorbing the massive, horrific magnitude of his ultimate true betrayal. My own son was aggressively trying to completely drain the very last remaining dollars of my hard-earned entire life savings simply to save his incredibly manipulative racist wife from legally defaulting on a massive fraudulent commercial bank loan. He was entirely willing to leave me entirely destitute, and permanently completely homeless just to desperately maintain their highly fake expensive internet wealth. The sheer evil of his incredibly selfish financial request solidified the cold, hard steel in my spine. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I walked slowly over to the small kitchen counter where my cell phone was resting in the deep shadows. I casually placed my right hand over the mobile device, shielding the screen from his view. I tapped the screen and opened my voice recording application, pressing the large red button to start capturing clear digital audio of our confidential conversation. I turned back to face my pathetic son. I stated $50,000 was a massive amount of cash. I admitted I had private savings locked away but was incredibly confused. I reminded him Brittany proudly announced he legally owned this property now. I asked him a very direct, logical question. I asked him why he did not simply take out a standard home equity line of credit against the main house to fund his business expansion. DeAndre violently flinched and nervously rubbed his neck. He stated he maxed out the bank equity, but the money vanished quickly. I demanded to know exactly how he successfully secured a federal bank loan without my legally required physical signature. DeAndre completely crumbled under the crushing pressure. He confessed on the digital recording that Brittany had aggressively threatened to completely divorce him. He admitted that he actively forged my exact legal signature on every single official federal bank loan document simply to desperately appease her endless greed. I quietly promised to review my private financial accounts tomorrow morning and sent him back to the main house. I silently pressed the small stop button to permanently secure his massive federal criminal confession safely today. The bright morning sun cast long, heavy shadows across the small, cramped backyard guest house where I had been forced to sleep. I woke up early feeling a cold sense of absolute dread settling deeply into my bones. The digital audio recording of my son confessing to severe federal bank fraud was safely, securely locked inside my phone, but the massive war was far from over. I needed to discreetly enter the primary main house to retrieve a specific batch of original mail that had been mistakenly delivered to the front porch instead of my new temporary mailbox. I smoothed down my simple cotton dress and walked slowly across the lush green lawn, feeling the cool morning dew soaking through my sensible shoes. The massive primary estate looked entirely quiet from the outside, but as I rounded the corner of the brick pathway, I suddenly stopped dead in my tracks. A large, unmarked white delivery box truck was aggressively parked directly in the center of my paved circular driveway. The heavy oak front door of my beautiful home was propped wide open, exposing the expensive polished hardwood floors of the main foyer to the outside elements. I heard the loud, chaotic sounds of heavy boots scraping harshly against the wood, and the loud, muffled voices of strange, unfamiliar men echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. My heart began to pound with a slow, terrifying rhythm of pure, absolute panic. I completely abandoned my usual slow, cautious pace and marched aggressively up the front brick steps, pushing past the heavy open door. I stepped directly into the main hallway and immediately froze in pure, absolute horror at the terrifying scene unfolding right in front of my eyes. 4 large, strange men wearing dirty work shirts were standing in the very center of my formal dining room. They were aggressively, violently dismantling my incredibly beautiful, priceless, antique mahogany dining table. That specific mahogany table was absolutely not just a simple piece of household furniture. It was a completely irreplaceable, priceless family heirloom that had been meticulously passed down through 4 proud generations of my family. It was the exact sacred place where I had lovingly hosted 3 decades of joyful Thanksgiving dinners, beautiful Christmas morning breakfasts, and countless quiet family celebrations. It held the deep, profound spiritual history of my resilient ancestors carved directly into the smooth, dark wood. I watched in absolute sickening horror as one of the strange men carelessly dragged a heavy metal wrench across the polished mahogany surface, leaving a long, deep, ugly scratch right down the center of the beautiful wood. "Stop exactly what you are doing right now," I ordered, my voice ringing loudly with absolute fierce authority, echoing sharply against the high ceiling of the dining room. "Put those heavy tools down immediately and step completely away from my dining table." The four large men completely stopped what they were doing and looked up at me with expressions of mild confusion. They were clearly just ordinary independent movers hired for a simple local delivery job, and they had absolutely no idea they were actively participating in a massive, severe federal crime. One of the older men wiped his sweaty forehead with the back of his dirty hand and took a slow, hesitant step backward, holding a large, thick piece of bubble wrap. "Look, lady, we are just doing the specific job we were heavily paid to do," he said defensively. "The wealthy lady of the massive house sold this huge table online yesterday, and she paid us extra cash to safely haul it out of here this morning." Before I could carefully explain to the confused moving men that the expensive table was completely stolen property, the swinging kitchen doors violently flew open. Brittany marched aggressively into the formal dining room, followed closely by her incredibly racist, arrogant mother, Susan. Brittany was wearing another highly expensive designer silk outfit, holding her shiny smartphone and looking completely unapologetic. "What exactly is the massive, loud problem in here?" Brittany demanded, her voice dripping with extreme toxic condescension and absolute pure arrogance. I pointed a shaking finger directly at the massive mahogany table, demanding to know exactly why she was actively allowing complete strangers to completely dismantle and violently steal my priceless family heirloom. Brittany let out a loud, sharp, mocking laugh, completely rolling her pale eyes at my genuine, deep distress. "Oh, Yvonne, you are being completely ridiculous and incredibly dramatic this morning," she sneered, waving her manicured hand dismissively at the incredibly valuable antique furniture. "I successfully sold that massive, ugly old wooden thing to a highly wealthy private internet buyer late last night for a huge amount of quick liquid cash. I am hosting a massive, exclusive luxury launch party for my brand new lifestyle company this coming Saturday night, and I desperately needed to clear out this incredibly depressing dark space to make room for the modern, expensive catered buffet stations. Plus, we completely needed the extra fast cash to heavily fund the premium open bar and the expensive luxury decorations. It is my massive expensive house now, and I can easily sell any piece of outdated garbage I absolutely want to sell. You have absolutely no legal right to aggressively barge into my primary estate and severely harass my hired delivery workers today." Susan proudly stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her greedy, manipulative daughter. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated, racist disgust, crossing her thin arms tightly over her chest. "You really need to mind your own pathetic business." Yvonne Susan mocked, her voice incredibly harsh and totally unforgiving. "You are absolutely nothing but a crazy old paying tenant who lives in a tiny, dirty shed in the backyard. You completely do not own a single valuable thing inside this beautiful, massive estate anymore. My successful daughter is the absolute wealthy lady of this manor, and she is completely graciously upgrading the entire depressing aesthetic of this horrible old house. Stop aggressively acting like a deranged, crazy old woman in front of the hired help, and quietly go back to your tiny little shed before we are forced to completely call the local police and have you legally arrested for severe trespassing." The four moving men shifted very uncomfortably on their feet, looking back and forth between us. They clearly realized they had walked directly into a highly toxic, massive family dispute, but they had already been fully paid the cash up front. They slowly bent back down and completely resumed violently disassembling the thick, heavy wooden legs of the antique table. The absolute profound, sheer disrespect and the massive, horrible humiliation of being completely verbally degraded in my own formal dining room in front of complete strangers was almost entirely unbearable. My hands curled into incredibly tight, heavy fists at my sides, and every single instinct in my body screamed at me to physically, aggressively fight back, to physically block the wide front door, and fiercely protect my family legacy. But the brilliant, cold forensic real estate appraiser inside my logical mind completely took over and forced my shaking body to remain perfectly still. I knew with absolute flawless certainty that if I caused a massive physical scene or aggressively called the local police right now today, Brittany would simply play the terrified victim and completely ruin my massive secret federal investigation. I absolutely could not afford to tip my hand and let them know the massive federal trap was rapidly, securely closing all around them. I took a very slow, incredibly deep breath, completely forcing the burning hot tears of pure rage back down into my chest. I uncurled my tight, heavy fists and slowly stepped backward, clearing the main pathway to the wide-open front door. I stood silently in the grand foyer and simply watched in quiet, absolute agony as the four strange men carelessly carried the massive, heavy pieces of my priceless family history right out the front door and aggressively loaded them directly into the dark back of the cheap rented delivery truck. Brittany and Susan completely openly smirked at me, completely genuinely believing they had finally entirely broken my absolute strong, independent spirit once and for all today. I turned my back on their arrogant, pale faces and walked slowly back across the bright green lawn toward the small, quiet backyard guest house. As soon as the thin wooden door was completely securely locked behind me, I immediately pulled my cell phone directly out of my deep dress pocket. I quickly opened my encrypted text messages and typed a highly urgent, incredibly important message directly to my brilliant paralegal daughter, Maya. I explicitly told her they had just illegally sold the massive antique dining table for quick liquid cash. I firmly ordered Maya to add severe federal grand larceny to the rapidly growing massive list of official criminal charges we were meticulously preparing for the Federal Bureau of Investigation today. The entire week leading up to the massive weekend launch party was an absolute chaotic nightmare of loud delivery trucks and arrogant event planners swarming my beautiful property. I stayed completely hidden inside the small, cramped backyard guest house, quietly watching the massive, extensive preparations through the thin, dusty window panes. Huge white commercial catering vans aggressively blocked my long paved driveway, while dozens of hired workers carried massive, expensive floral arrangements and heavy sound equipment directly into my formal living room. Brittany was aggressively spending the absolute last remaining pennies of my stolen home equity loan to desperately create a completely fake illusion of massive extreme wealth. She was actively preparing to host a highly exclusive luxury launch party this coming Saturday night to aggressively secure more funding from high-profile local investors and wealthy internet influencers. She desperately needed to completely convince these incredibly rich private developers that she was a massive, successful corporate queen, so she could illegally sell my entire massive estate right out from under me before the federal bank auditors officially caught on to her massive, severe fraudulent loan documents. On Friday afternoon, just 24 hours before the massive, luxurious event was officially scheduled to begin, I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of expensive designer heels marching quickly across the concrete backyard patio. The thin wooden door of my small guest house violently rattled as Brittany pounded her small, manicured fists aggressively against the cheap wood. I slowly stood up from my uncomfortable, narrow mattress and quietly opened the thin door, keeping my physical posture completely intentionally slumped and looking directly down at my plain, sensible shoes. Brittany stood on the small concrete porch wearing a pristine, custom-tailored white designer suit and holding a thick, expensive clipboard tightly against her chest. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, absolute, unadulterated disgust, completely treating me like a highly infectious disease that she desperately needed to entirely, permanently eradicate from her pristine, wealthy environment. "Listen to me very carefully. Yvonne," she snapped, her voice incredibly harsh and completely, totally devoid of any basic human warmth or simple common decency. "I am hosting a massive, incredibly important luxury launch party inside the primary estate tomorrow night, and I absolutely cannot afford any foolish, chaotic interruptions from a crazy old woman. We have incredibly wealthy, high-profile local investors and highly famous internet influencers arriving at my beautiful home tomorrow evening. Brittany continued, her tone dripping with intense, extreme, toxic condescension and absolute pure arrogance. These are incredibly powerful, rich people who are actively looking to heavily invest massive amounts of liquid cash directly into my growing luxury lifestyle. Brand. Everything has to look completely perfectly flawless and entirely incredibly high-end to successfully secure their massive financial investments tomorrow night. Therefore, I am giving you a very strict, absolute direct order right now today. You are going to stay completely securely locked inside this tiny, dirty little guest house for the entire duration of the massive, luxurious party. You will completely turn off all your inside lights, you will completely, firmly shut your thin curtains, and you will absolutely not make a single tiny sound until Sunday morning. You are entirely, strictly banned from stepping a single foot outside this small wooden door, while my wealthy, important guests are actively socializing on the massive back patio and enjoying the expensive catered food I kept. My head completely bowed, looking directly at the concrete porch, and slowly nodded my head in a perfect display of complete pathetic submission. Brittany aggressively leaned much closer to my face completely, invading my personal physical space to heavily deliver her final, incredibly cruel, strict ultimatum. You absolutely, completely do not fit the high-class modern aesthetic of my expensive luxury brand, Yvonne. She sneered, her cold, pale eyes flashing with pure, malicious, intense cruelty. You look exactly like a completely tired, broken old woman, and your deeply outdated presence would completely, severely embarrass me in front of all my rich, powerful friends. If you foolishly decide to stubbornly wander out of this tiny little shed and aggressively ruin my incredibly important, wealthy aesthetic. Tomorrow night, I will absolutely immediately call my private armed security guards to violently physically drag you directly off my massive property in front of everyone. Do you completely, entirely understand my strict absolute orders, Yvonne? Or do I need to explicitly have DeAndre come out here and loudly scream them directly into your face today? I forced my physical body to completely, violently tremble, simulating absolute, pure, intense fear. I completely, entirely understand exactly what you want, Brittany, I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly weak and totally, thoroughly defeated. I promise I will stay completely, firmly, securely locked inside the tiny guest house all night long. I will absolutely not embarrass you or DeAndre in front of your wealthy, important guests. I will remain completely, entirely invisible, just like you explicitly ordered me to do. Today. Brittany let out a loud, sharp, arrogant laugh, completely, thoroughly enjoying her massive, perceived, ultimate victory over my strong, independent spirit. She genuinely, completely believed she had entirely, permanently crushed my absolute personal dignity. "Good!" she snapped loudly, completely abruptly, turning her back on me and confidently strutting back across the bright green lawn toward the massive primary estate. Just remember your exact pathetic place. Yvonne, and tomorrow night will go completely, perfectly smoothly for everyone involved today. I stood perfectly, completely still in the open doorway of the tiny guest house, watching her completely disappear inside the heavy glass back doors of my beautiful, massive home. The very second she was completely, permanently out of my direct sight, the fake, pathetic, submissive trembling entirely, completely stopped. I slowly stood up, incredibly, perfectly straight, and allowed a very slow, extremely chilling, deeply serene smile to completely, entirely spread across my entire face. She honestly, completely, incredibly, genuinely believed I was going to quietly sit entirely alone in the dark shadows while she aggressively, illegally sold my entire beautiful life savings to a corrupt private real estate developer right inside my own formal living room. She was completely, utterly, incredibly, deeply mistaken. Today, I slowly turned around and walked directly back inside the quiet, cramped guest house, completely, firmly, securely locking the thin wooden door behind me. I absolutely, completely, totally refused to be entirely invisible inside my own massive, beautiful house tomorrow night. I walked completely purposefully, directly over to the small, narrow closet tucked securely into the dark back corner of the tiny bedroom space. I reached out and slowly pulled the small wooden door wide open entirely, exposing the very few personal garments I had successfully aggressively managed to completely secretly smuggle out of the massive primary estate during the highly illegal forced eviction process. I pushed past the plain, simple everyday cotton dresses and reached completely directly all the way to the very absolute far back of the incredibly narrow dark space. My hand securely, completely, firmly grasped the smooth, heavy plastic garment bag I had intentionally, meticulously, securely hidden there for this exact, specific, highly important moment. I slowly, carefully, completely unzipped the thick, protective, heavy plastic covering, entirely revealing my absolute finest, sharpest, incredibly, most expensive, custom-tailored formal church suit. It was a completely magnificent, deep, rich, emerald green silk suit with incredibly sharp, elegant, perfectly constructed lapels and a highly beautifully tailored matching midi-length skirt. I had completely, entirely, specifically purchased this incredible, absolutely stunning, expensive outfit to proudly wear when I formally, gracefully received my massive Lifetime Achievement Corporate Award from the National Commercial Real Estate Appraisal Board 5 short years ago. It was an outfit completely, entirely designed for a highly powerful, incredibly successful, deeply independent professional woman who entirely commanded absolute, complete, total respect the very second she confidently, aggressively walked into any massive corporate boardroom. I carefully, gently took the beautiful emerald green suit off the hanger and gently laid it perfectly, completely flat across the small, narrow guest bed. I placed my incredibly expensive, matching designer emerald shoes directly, neatly, perfectly. Right next to the beautiful silk skirt, I was absolutely, completely not going to cower in the dark, quiet shadows like a deeply frightened, pathetic, beaten animal, while arrogant thieves aggressively, completely tried to entirely steal my massive, hard-earned kingdom. Tomorrow night, I was going to proudly, confidently, fiercely put on my absolute finest, sharpest armor and proudly march directly straight into the massive center of her highly, fake, expensive, incredibly, completely fraudulent luxury party. Brittany completely, entirely, foolishly wanted an incredibly massive, beautiful, unforgettable luxury show tomorrow night. I was absolutely, completely, entirely ready to aggressively, beautifully give her the absolute, exact, specific, incredibly massive, unforgettable, deeply destructive show she truly, genuinely, entirely deserved today. The massive, powerful federal trap was perfectly set, and the ultimate, glorious, beautiful absolute destruction was finally, entirely arriving, completely, perfectly, tomorrow morning. The heavy bass of the loud electronic music violently vibrated through the thin wooden walls of the small, cramped guest house. It was officially Saturday night, and my completely stolen property was currently swarming with hundreds of incredibly wealthy private investors and famous local internet influencers. I stood perfectly still in front of the tiny, cracked bathroom mirror, completely ignoring the massive, loud, chaotic noise echoing across my beautiful green backyard. I carefully zipped up my stunning, custom-tailored, deep emerald green silk suit, smoothing the luxurious, expensive fabric down over my hips. I clipped a pair of beautiful, heavy, vintage gold earrings onto my earlobes and applied a bold, dark red lipstick to my mouth. I did not look like a pathetic, defeated old woman, completely hiding in the dark shadows like my arrogant daughter-in-law aggressively ordered me to do just yesterday. I looked incredibly ready today. I looked like a highly successful, incredibly powerful, forensic commercial real estate appraiser completely ready to entirely dismantle a massive fraudulent corporate empire. I slipped my feet securely into my expensive designer emerald green leather heels and took a very slow, incredibly deep, calming breath. The massive federal trap was meticulously set, and my brilliant daughter Maya was currently waiting securely on standby outside the heavy iron front gates. I unlocked the thin wooden door of the tiny guest house and stepped out into the cool evening air, entirely ready to completely crash the most incredibly expensive fake luxury launch party of the entire decade today. The massive primary estate was completely brightly illuminated by dozens of massive expensive rented spotlights, casting long dramatic shadows across the lush, perfectly manicured green lawns. I walked slowly, confidently across the dark concrete patio, completely avoiding the main outdoor catering stations completely today. Dozens of hired waiters, wearing crisp white tuxedo shirts, frantically prepared expensive, exotic appetizers for the incredibly massive crowd. The sheer, unadulterated, absolute audacity of the massive, elaborate event was completely, entirely sickening to witness. Brittany had completely aggressively drained the absolute last remaining drops of my stolen $500,000 home equity loan to aggressively rent massive outdoor crystal chandeliers and highly expensive imported floral arrangements. She was desperately trying to completely convince these highly wealthy private developers that she was a massive, successful corporate queen with incredibly unlimited liquid cash. I smoothly, completely bypassed the massive, crowded back patio and walked quietly around the dark paved side pathway directly toward the wide front circular driveway. I wanted to officially make a massive grand entrance through my own beautiful, heavy oak front doors. As I rounded the dark brick corner, I saw 3 expensive private valet drivers waiting. They were aggressively parking highly luxurious imported sports cars along the edge of my quiet suburban street. The fake luxury illusion was completely perfectly constructed, but it was entirely built on a massive, fragile foundation of severe federal bank fraud and aggressive stolen equity today. I walked confidently up the wide brick front steps and completely ignored the massive private armed security guard standing directly outside my heavy oak front doors. He took one single look at my incredibly sharp, expensive emerald green silk suit and my absolutely perfect, regal, elegant posture, and he immediately quickly opened the massive front door for me, completely assuming I was one of the incredibly wealthy, important private investors invited to the exclusive luxury event tonight. I stepped directly into my beautiful grand foyer and completely stopped perfectly still, allowing the massive, chaotic, loud energy of the incredibly crowded room to wash over me. The formal living room and the massive open dining area were entirely, completely packed with incredibly rich, powerful local developers and highly famous, wealthy internet personalities holding expensive crystal champagne flutes. I held my head incredibly high, keeping my shoulders perfectly strictly thrown back, and slowly began to walk directly straight into the very center of the massive, incredibly bright, crowded room. I looked absolutely completely regal and entirely, totally, undeniably powerful. My highly confident, fierce, elegant presence immediately completely commanded the absolute entire attention of the massive, wealthy crowd. The loud, chaotic conversations physically nearest to me completely entirely stopped as the highly wealthy, important guests slowly turned their heads to actively, carefully, respectfully admire my incredibly sharp, custom-tailored, expensive emerald silk suit today. I casually, gracefully accepted a tall, thin crystal glass of sparkling imported champagne from a passing hired waiter and smiled a bright, incredibly charming, completely warm smile directly at the highly wealthy older gentleman standing perfectly right next to me. He was a very famous, highly powerful local commercial real estate developer I had actually briefly, professionally crossed paths with several long years ago during a massive corporate property appraisal. I immediately gracefully extended my hand and introduced myself with extreme professional charm, completely seamlessly blending right into the highly exclusive, rich luxury aesthetic Brittany so desperately, aggressively wanted to completely project tonight. I politely, eloquently engaged him in a highly complex, sophisticated conversation about the current local commercial property market, completely effortlessly demonstrating my massive, deep, highly professional financial intellect and my absolute immense personal wealth. As I politely laughed at a small, polite joke he smoothly delivered, I slowly, casually scanned the massive, crowded room directly over his expensive, tailored shoulder. I immediately completely spotted my incredibly greedy daughter-in-law standing directly near the massive stone fireplace, completely aggressively surrounded by a large group of young, wealthy internet influencers. Brittany was wearing a completely ridiculously massive, expensive, sparkling diamond-covered formal gown that probably cost thousands of stolen dollars. She was loudly, arrogantly boasting about her fake luxury corporate brand, completely acting like the absolute perfect, incredibly wealthy, gracious hostess. Then she slowly turned her pale head and looked directly across the massive, crowded room, right at me. The incredibly bright, arrogant, fake smile entirely instantly vanished completely from her heavily made-up pale face. The total, absolute, sheer panic immediately violently exploded in her cold, wide eyes as she actively, completely realized the pathetic, broken old woman she had completely, illegally, aggressively locked inside the tiny, dirty backyard shed was currently proudly, confidently standing directly in the exact center of her highly important, incredibly expensive, fake luxury party. She completely, immediately, dropped her expensive crystal champagne flute directly onto the polished hardwood floor, completely ignoring the loud, sharp, shattering sound of the breaking delicate glass. I saw DeAndre standing completely terrified a few short feet away, his face completely, entirely draining of all human color as he aggressively, instantly realized the massive, terrible, catastrophic disaster rapidly unfolding right in front of his deeply cowardly, spineless eyes. I completely, entirely ignored their massive, visible, frantic, intense panic. I simply took a very slow, elegant, graceful sip of my expensive sparkling champagne and offered a highly warm, polite, completely genuine smile to another highly wealthy private investor standing directly nearby, smoothly, gracefully, completely pulling him into my highly engaging professional conversation. I was completely, effortlessly, totally, naturally, completely dominating her massive, expensive luxury room without even slightly attempting to aggressively try. I was completely, gracefully, confidently stealing absolutely all the highly important wealthy attention she so desperately, completely, heavily needed to actively, successfully, completely secure her illegal, fraudulent real estate sale tonight. I watched completely, carefully, smoothly, from the very absolute corner of my eye, as Brittany aggressively, violently pushed her way directly straight through the large, dense, heavy crowd of highly rich, important guests. Her pale face was completely, entirely flushed, a massive, deep, dark, aggressive, angry red, burning with pure, absolute, unadulterated, toxic fury and intense, extreme, completely panicked desperation. She was marching incredibly aggressively directly straight toward me, completely willing to cause a massive, horrible, highly embarrassing, chaotic, violent scene, just to desperately, heavily, fiercely, aggressively protect her massive, terrible, illegal, completely fraudulent financial lies today. She aggressively shoved past a highly wealthy internet personality, completely ignoring the loud, shocked gasp of the offended famous digital influencer. She completely, fiercely, violently, aggressively reached out her highly manicured, greedy, pale hand and incredibly, violently, aggressively, tightly grabbed me directly, incredibly harshly by my silk-covered arm, entirely, completely, officially, aggressively starting the massive, final explosive, absolute, total, completely final destruction tonight. She deeply dug her sharp, perfectly manicured, incredibly expensive, long artificial fingernails directly deep into the incredibly luxurious, soft, completely expensive emerald green silk fabric, completely, actively, desperately trying to, incredibly, aggressively, physically intimidate me, completely right in front of the entirely massive, completely shocked, highly wealthy, important corporate crowd tonight. I absolutely did not completely, entirely flinch or completely aggressively, rapidly aggressively pull away from her. Extremely, highly violent, desperate, completely, totally aggressive, highly panicked, completely, entirely physical grasp today. I simply, entirely, completely, slowly turned my head, completely maintaining my highly absolute, Completely, totally perfect, regal, elegant, completely, incredibly massive, powerful posture, and looked completely, directly, entirely straight, deeply into her incredibly wide, highly terrified, utterly doomed eyes. The sharp artificial fingernails of my daughter-in-law dug deeply into the luxurious emerald silk of my custom-tailored sleeve. I looked directly down at her pale, trembling hand and then slowly raised my eyes to meet her absolutely terrified, furious gaze. "What exactly are you doing in here, Yvonne?" Brittany hissed, her voice dropping into a harsh, vicious whisper, so the wealthy private investors standing just a few feet away could not hear her aggressive threats. "I specifically gave you a strict, absolute direct order to remain completely, securely locked inside the tiny, dirty guest house tonight. You are deliberately trying to completely ruin my massive, important luxury launch party, and I will absolutely not tolerate this incredible insubordination for another single second." She leaned her flushed, angry face incredibly close to mine, her expensive, heavy perfume completely suffocating the fresh air around us. "If you do not immediately turn around and walk quietly out the front door right this very second, I am going to immediately signal my private armed security guards to come inside and violently physically drag you directly off my massive property in front of every single important, wealthy guest today." Before I could even offer a completely calm, polite response to her incredibly desperate, pathetic threats, another highly aggressive, toxic presence completely, entirely invaded my personal physical space. Susan, Brittany's incredibly arrogant, deeply racist, bankrupt mother, aggressively stepped directly right in front of me, completely, actively attempting to physically block my entire body from the direct view of the highly wealthy, important corporate crowd. Susan was wearing a highly expensive, borrowed formal dress that she absolutely entirely could not afford, and she glared at me with pure, unadulterated, toxic disgust. "You really have absolutely no complete shame here. You really have absolutely no complete shame at all, do you, Yvonne?" Susan sneered, her voice dripping with intense, extreme, absolute condescension and sheer malicious cruelty. "My brilliant, successful daughter finally builds a massive, wealthy, luxurious corporate empire, and you just incredibly selfishly decide to aggressively crash her highly exclusive private event wearing that completely ridiculous, flashy green outfit. You are absolutely nothing but a deeply pathetic, crazy old woman who completely refuses to accept the harsh, permanent reality of her new, pathetic, incredibly low station in life. You need to immediately, respectfully listen to your absolute betters today. You need to immediately, respectfully listen to your absolute betters and quietly, completely disappear back into the dark shadows where you truly, genuinely belong today before we are completely, entirely forced to publicly humiliate you." I stood perfectly, completely still, trapped between the two incredibly greedy, highly manipulative women who had actively, aggressively stolen my entire massive life savings and my beautiful, expensive home. They completely, genuinely believed that their physical, aggressive intimidation and their harsh, cruel, whispered threats would instantly, entirely cause my strong, independent spirit to completely, permanently crumble and break right there in the living room. They fully expected me to immediately lower my head, completely, burst into pathetic, weak tears, and quietly, entirely run away, out the massive, heavy oak front doors, entirely, completely defeated by their supreme, wealthy, arrogant authority. But I absolutely, completely, entirely refused to give them a single tiny ounce of that highly unearned, pathetic satisfaction tonight. I did not violently pull my silk-covered arm away from Brittany's incredibly tight, aggressive physical grasp, and I absolutely, completely did not take a single hesitant step backward, away from Susan's highly aggressive, deeply toxic, physical blocking maneuver today in my beautiful home. Instead, I simply, entirely, completely looked right past their deeply angry, pale faces and gently, softly smiled directly at the highly wealthy, important private real estate developer I had been politely conversing with just a few short moments ago. Then I slowly, deliberately turned my absolute cold, piercing gaze directly back down to Brittany. "Down. You are making a highly terrible, massive, chaotic scene in front of your incredibly important, wealthy corporate guests. Brittany, I whispered, my voice remaining completely, perfectly even, and incredibly, entirely calm, despite the massive raging fire of pure, absolute righteous justice burning fiercely deep today. I highly carefully, gently, but with incredible, absolute physical firmness, completely removed her shaking, pale hand directly, entirely off my expensive emerald green silk sleeve. I completely, entirely, smoothly smoothed out the incredibly tiny, small wrinkle she had aggressively caused in the luxurious, expensive fabric, and I completely, entirely, confidently took a very slow, bold, highly deliberate step entirely directly forward. Susan aggressively, actively tried to completely, physically step directly into my strict forward path again, but I absolutely, entirely refused to let her aggressively push me around my own massive, beautiful home for another single second of real time. I completely, entirely, effortlessly, completely smoothly stepped right around her highly stiff, rigid physical body, completely, entirely, ignoring her loud, sharp gasp of pure, absolute, highly offended shock. I completely, entirely, intentionally, gracefully, completely left both of those incredibly toxic, greedy, bankrupt women standing completely, absolutely, entirely alone in the very absolute dark corners of the massive, formal living room. I walked with absolute, complete, total, undeniable, regal, fierce power, completely directly straight into the very exact, absolute bright center of the massive, incredibly highly crowded, expensive party. My beautiful emerald green silk suit completely, entirely, beautifully, loudly shining. My beautiful suit completely caught the massive, bright, sparkling light of the huge, heavy, imported crystal chandeliers hanging directly high above our heads tonight. I stopped completely, perfectly still, in the very exact, absolute center of the massive open space, entirely, completely surrounded by hundreds of highly wealthy, famous local developers and rich internet influencers. There was a long, expensive catering table positioned perfectly right next to me, entirely, completely covered in highly expensive, imported exotic foods and dozens of tall, thin, beautiful crystal champagne flutes. I completely, entirely, slowly, gracefully reached my hand, entirely, completely, right safely out. I carefully, gently picked up a highly heavy, solid, polished silver catering spoon. I then smoothly, gracefully, completely picked up a completely empty, thin, delicate crystal champagne flute in my other steady, completely calm, firm hand. The loud, heavy electronic dance music was still violently, aggressively pumping, completely, entirely through the massive, expensive rented sound system, actively, completely making it incredibly deeply difficult for anyone to easily, clearly hear normal, polite conversations across the massive, incredibly crowded room today. I raised the heavy, polished, solid silver spoon and completely, deliberately, gently, completely, firmly clinked it directly, actively, completely, entirely now. I completely, deliberately, gently, firmly clinked it directly, actively against the thin, delicate side of the expensive crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear, high-pitched ringing sound was incredibly beautifully piercing, completely actively, entirely cutting directly, entirely straight through the massive, heavy, loud bass of the electronic party music. I struck the beautiful crystal glass 3 highly distinct separate times, completely actively, intentionally, sending the loud, clear, beautiful ringing sound directly echoing completely entirely throughout the massive high-vaulted ceilings of my beautiful, expensive primary estate. The highly wealthy, important guests standing physically directly nearest to me completely, entirely stopped. They entirely, immediately stopped their polite conversations and completely, actively turned their heads to actively look directly at me. I completely, entirely, gracefully offered them a highly warm, polite, completely welcoming, confident smile, completely, actively holding the silver spoon and the crystal glass highly gracefully, directly, entirely up in the air today. The hired professional disc jockey standing directly, completely across the massive formal living room, completely entirely noticed the sudden immediate shift in the massive heavy crowded room. He completely quickly, nervously, entirely completely faded, the massive loud electronic dance music completely entirely down to dead, absolute silence. The massive, incredibly expensive crowded formal living room completely, instantly, entirely fell. Completely, entirely dead. Perfectly silent. Hundreds of highly important wealthy private investors, famous local digital influencers, and expensive hired catering staff completely, entirely stopped exactly, completely what they were, entirely, completely actively doing, and entirely, completely, totally turned their absolute full, undivided, highly respectful attention completely, entirely, directly, straight toward me. I took a very slow, incredibly deep, highly calming breath, entirely, completely, perfectly centering my absolute strong, fierce internal spirit and preparing my highly confident professional voice inside my beautiful, grand, formal living room today. I would completely, absolutely, entirely love to officially, warmly, deeply welcome every single one of you highly important, wonderful guests here tonight directly into my own personal private home. I announced my voice completely radiating with pure, absolute, highly confident, completely warm, entirely generous, completely wealthy, supreme hospitality. Brittany was completely, entirely, absolutely frozen, perfectly, entirely still near the massive, expensive stone fireplace, her pale face entirely drained of blood. DeAndre. She suddenly, aggressively, intensely, loudly shrieked her highly shrill, panicked, desperate voice, violently, completely shattering the beautiful, quiet room. DeAndre, stop your completely crazy, pathetic mother right now today. The silence that followed my announcement was absolute and heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on every single person in my beautiful, formal living room. I stood perfectly straight in my emerald green silk suit, the light from the massive crystal chandeliers reflecting off my gold earrings and highlighting the calm, steady expression on my face. Brittany was still frozen near the fireplace, her face a ghostly shade of white, as she stared at me with wide eyes that were flickering between pure terror and homicidal rage. DeAndre was standing right next to her, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He was trembling so violently that the ice in his glass was rattling against the crystal. The wealthy investors and famous influencers around me began to whisper and murmur among themselves, their curiosity quickly turning into deep suspicion. Brittany finally managed to find her voice again, but it was no longer the sweet melodic tone of a luxury hostess. It was a sharp, desperate screech that cut through the quiet room like a jagged blade. She pointed a shaking finger at me and looked at the crowd. "Do not listen to this crazy old woman," she shouted, her voice cracking with pure panic. "She is a disgruntled former tenant who is clearly having a massive mental breakdown because she cannot accept that her time has passed. This is my house, and this is my event. Security, please remove her immediately from the premises right now." She gestured wildly toward the large white wall at the far end of the ballroom, where a massive state-of-the-art projector had been set up to display the shimmering gold logo of her fake lifestyle brand. She wanted to distract everyone with her beautiful digital illusions, but she had absolutely no idea that my daughter Maya was already in position at the back of the room near the technical control booth. Maya had spent years as a senior paralegal, learning exactly how to present evidence that could destroy the most powerful criminals, and she was about to give the performance of her life. Brittany turned to the crowd and forced a frantic fake smile onto her face. "Please ignore the drama," she said, her voice high and breathless. "If you look at the screen, you will see the future of true luxury and the immense value of the sterling portfolio that you all are here to invest in tonight." On my signal, Maya hit the primary override key on the main control console. The shimmering gold logo of the fake sterling brand did not just fade away, it was violently replaced by a series of high-resolution scans of legal documents that made the entire room gasp in collective shock. The massive wall was suddenly illuminated, not with luxury marketing, but with a bright, clear image of my original irrevocable trust agreement from 10 years ago. The bold black letters stated in plain English that the property could not be sold or leveraged without my explicit written consent. Before Brittany could even process what she was looking at, Maya clicked the next slide. A massive side-by-side comparison appeared on the wall, showing my real signature from my passport and the clumsy, childish forgery DeAndre had used to secure the $500,000 home equity loan. The room went dead silent as the wealthy investors, including the powerful billionaire developer standing next to me, leaned forward to inspect the obvious crime. I stepped forward and raised my voice so that every single person in the house could hear me clearly. As a retired commercial real estate appraiser, I have spent 30 years identifying fraud, and today I am appraising the absolute ruin of these two criminals, I said, my voice booming with a fierce authority. The house you are standing in was never legally available for a loan because it belongs to a protected trust. My son DeAndre and his wife Brittany committed federal bank fraud and identity theft to steal the equity of an elderly woman. Maya clicked the next slide, and the crowd let out another loud murmur of disgust. The screen now showed the official bank statements for Brittany's corporate shell account, showing a current balance of exactly $0.42. It also showed a long list of payments made to debt collectors for Susan's gambling debts and thousands of dollars spent on fake social media followers from offshore bot farms. I looked directly at the wealthy investors who were now backing away from Brittany as if she were radioactive. They were not here to invest in a luxury brand, I told them. They were being lured here so that these two could illegally sell this property to a private developer for quick cash before the bank discovered their fraud and foreclosed on the house. They are broke, they are desperate, and they are absolute frauds who were willing to leave their own mother homeless to fund a fake internet life. Brittany let out a guttural scream of rage and lunged toward me, but two of the investors stepped in her way to protect me. The billionaire developer looked at the screen and then looked at me with a nod of profound respect. He turned to Brittany and told her that he had never seen such a disgusting display of greed in his entire professional life. The party was over, and the absolute total public humiliation of my son and his wife was officially complete as the guests began to realize they had almost become accomplices to a massive federal crime. The billionaire developer, whose name was Marcus Sterling and who was ironically no relation to Brittany, looked directly at the projector screen with the focused eyes of a man who had seen every trick in the book. He saw the technical routing numbers and the specific loan identification codes that Maya had highlighted in bright red. I watched as he slowly turned his back on Brittany and faced the rest of the high-profile guests in the room. He told the crowd that as a man who owns half of the downtown skyline, he could confirm that the documents on the wall were a perfect blueprint for a federal prison sentence. He thanked me for speaking up and saving them all from a massive legal nightmare. Brittany was now sobbing, but they were not tears of regret. They were tears of a cornered animal who had finally realized the trap had closed. She looked over at DeAndre and began to scream at him, calling him a weak, pathetic loser and blaming him for getting caught. She screamed that he was the one who signed the papers, and he was the one who was going to go to jail while she would find a way to stay on top. DeAndre just stood there, his face a mask of pure, hollow misery as he realized that the woman he had betrayed his own mother for was now throwing him to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. Susan, Brittany's mother, tried to step forward and intervene, but the crowd of influencers was already recording everything on their phones. The story of the fake luxury queen was going viral in real time. Susan tried to shout that they were being harassed and that this was all a misunderstanding, but her voice was drowned out by the collective disdain of the people she had tried so hard to impress. I walked over to the center of the room and looked at the three of them. I told them that they had made a very big mistake when they underestimated the intelligence of a woman who has spent her life looking for what is hidden. I told Brittany that her rent notice was the smartest thing she ever did because it gave me the exact routing number I needed to track her down. I told them that their fake party was now officially a crime scene and that they should enjoy the next few minutes of freedom because they would be their last. The room was filled with the sound of hushed, angry voices and the constant clicking of camera shutters as the high society of the city witnessed the total and absolute downfall of the Sterling brand right in the middle of their own stolen living room. I turned my attention back to the massive screen where Maya had now displayed a specific image of a legal document from the county clerk's office. It was a notice of a pending private sale agreement that Brittany had secretly drafted with a notorious predatory development firm. The document showed that she was planning to sell the house for 60% of its actual market value just to get the cash quickly and disappear. The crowd was absolutely horrified. To see a family home treated like a piece of stolen jewelry was too much for even the most hardened business people in the room. I explained to the guests that the $10,000 monthly mortgage payment was due in just 72 hours and that Brittany knew she couldn't pay it. I told them she was planning to take their investment money and the developer's cash and flee the state, leaving the bank to deal with the wreckage, and leaving me with nothing. The investors were looking at their own bank representatives in the room, whispering about how close they came to losing millions. DeAndre finally broke his silence, but it was only to beg me for mercy. He started walking toward me with his hands outstretched, crying about how he was his mother's only son and how he had been blinded by love. I looked at him and reminded him that love does not forge a mother's name on a federal loan. I reminded him that love does not put a 62-year-old woman in a backyard shed on her birthday. I told him that he had chosen his path, and now he had to walk it all the way to the end. Brittany tried to physically attack the tech booth to get to Maya, but the private security guards she had hired to keep me out were now the ones holding her back because they realized they might not get paid for the night. The absolute irony of the situation was not lost on anyone. The very people she hired to protect her fake image were now the witnesses to her true character. I stood in the center of the room, a retired appraiser who had just finished the most important job of her life. I had appraised the value of my children, and I had found one to be priceless and the other to be completely worthless. The silence in the room was now replaced by the distant sound of sirens coming up the long driveway, and I knew that the federal agents were almost here to finish what I had started. The atmosphere in the grand living room had shifted from a celebration of fake success to a cold courtroom of public opinion. I looked around at the walls that I had painted myself and the floors that I had polished for 30 years. Every corner of this house had a memory attached to it, and these people had tried to turn those memories into cold, hard cash. I looked at Susan, who was now frantically trying to hide her designer handbag as if the police might take it. I told her that she should have stayed in the motel instead of trying to move into a bedroom that was never hers. I told her that her greed was the engine that drove her daughter to commit these crimes, and that she was just as guilty in the eyes of the truth. The influencers who were once laughing and drinking were now huddled in corners looking at their phones, realizing that their brand association with Brittany was going to ruin their own careers. The billionaire developer Marcus approached me one last time and shook my hand. He told me that if I ever wanted to come out of retirement, he had a dozen properties that needed an appraiser with my level of integrity. I thanked him, but told him that I was looking forward to a long, quiet retirement in a house that was finally safe from predators. I looked at the screen one last time as Maya put up the final image. It was a picture of my husband, who had passed away years ago and who had worked alongside me to buy this land. I felt his presence in the room, and I knew he would have been proud of the way I defended our legacy. I told the room that this house was built on a foundation of honest work, and that no amount of fake luxury could ever stand on top of a lie. The sirens were very close now, and the blue and red lights were starting to flash against the windows of the grand foyer. The party was truly over. I told Brittany and DeAndre to look around the room because this was the last time they would ever see the inside of a house this beautiful. I told them that the rent was finally due, and they were about to pay it for the next 30 years in a cell. The guests began to file out of the house in an orderly fashion, their faces filled with a mixture of shock and relief that they had escaped a scam. I stood alone in the center of the room with Maya, who had walked down from the tech booth to stand by my side. We were the only ones left who belonged here, and we were the only ones who truly knew what this house was worth. The federal agents were at the door, and I was ready to give them the keys to a case that was finally closed. The silence was finally broken by the sound of the front door being opened by the federal agents. I watched as they walked into the room in their dark jackets, and I felt a sense of finality that I had been waiting for since the night of my birthday. I pointed to the screen and told the agents that everything they needed was right there. I told them that the digital trail was complete and that the witnesses were all standing on the lawn. Brittany tried to run toward the kitchen, but an agent quickly blocked her path. DeAndre just sat on the floor with his head in his hands, finally realizing that his mother was not a victim, but a force of nature. I looked at my daughter Maya, and we shared a silent look of victory. We had saved the house, and we had saved our dignity. The story of the Henderson family was not going to be a tragedy of loss, but a triumph of truth. I walked toward the front door to greet the agents, feeling the weight of the last week finally lifting from my shoulders. I was Yvonne Henderson, and I was home. The image on the wall showed the specific date of the forgery, which was exactly 3 days after DeAndre had visited me to ask for a loan he knew I would never give. The signature was a shaky imitation of my own, and anyone who knew me could see the hesitation in the ink. The HELOC document was 20 pages long, and each page was a separate act of betrayal. I pointed to the interest rate, which was predatory and high, because the bank knew the risk was massive, even if they did not know the loan was fake. I explained to the silent crowd that the bank had already flagged the account for suspicious activity, and that Maya had provided the final evidence to push them over the edge. The horror on the faces of the investors was not just for me, but for themselves, because they realized that if a son could do this to a mother, he would certainly do it to a business partner. The ethical vacuum that Brittany and DeAndre lived in was now on full display, and the smell of their desperation was stronger than the expensive flowers in the room. I told the guests that the catered food was paid for with stolen money, and that they should leave it on the plates because it was the price of a mother's home. The shame in the room was palpable as people put down their glasses and walked away from the woman they had been praising just an hour ago. Brittany was a queen with no subjects and a hostess with no home. The final reveal was the most painful because it showed a private message from Brittany to her mother, saying that once the house was sold, they would put me in a state facility and never look back. The crowd gasped at the cruelty, and the mask was finally and permanently gone. The emerald green of my suit felt like armor as I stood in the center of the room. I thought about the generations of women in my family who had worked as domestic servants and laborers so that I could one day own a house like this. I thought about the sweat and the tears that went into every brick and every board. To see my own son try to hand that legacy over to a woman like Brittany was a pain that words can barely describe. But I was not just a mother. I was a professional who knew that the truth is the only currency that matters. I looked at the billionaire developer, and I saw the respect in his eyes. He knew that I had done something that most people are too afraid to do. I had looked at my own blood, and I had seen a stranger. I told the crowd that the real value of a home is the people who live in it and the honesty they share. I told them that the Sterling brand was a house of cards, and that the wind was finally blowing. The agents were now in the foyer, and the blue lights were casting long shadows across the floor. I looked at Brittany one last time, and I saw the empty shell of a woman who had tried to build a life on a foundation of lies. She was nothing more than a ghost in a diamond gown, and she was about to haunt a very different kind of house. I was ready to close this chapter and start a new one where the only people allowed in my home were the ones who knew the true meaning of the word family. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights, knowing that my name was still clean and my house was finally and truly mine, once again forever. The images on the massive white wall were not just pictures, they were the digital headstones of a criminal legacy that was dying in real time. The silence in my beautiful, formal living room was now replaced by a low, buzzing murmur that rippled through the crowd of wealthy investors and high-profile influencers. Every single person in the room was staring at the glowing evidence of the $500,000 loan, the forged signatures, and the empty bank accounts. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, my emerald green silk suit shining under the crystal chandeliers. I felt a profound sense of calm that I had not known for many years. The analytical mind of a forensic real estate appraiser had finished the final calculation, and the result was absolute justice. Brittany was still standing near the stone fireplace, and her face was a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She looked at the guests who were now backing away from her, and then she looked at me with a gaze that was filled with homicidal rage. "This is a lie," she suddenly shrieked, her voice cracking and echoing harshly against the high-vaulted ceilings. She pointed a shaking finger at the screen and looked at the billionaire developer Marcus, who was standing right next to me. "It is a deep fake," she screamed, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. "My mother-in-law is a bitter, jealous woman who spent thousands of dollars on a digital hit piece to destroy my reputation because she cannot handle my success. This is all AI-generated propaganda designed to smear my luxury brand. Do not believe a single pixel on that wall." Brittany turned toward the technical control booth where Maya was standing, but she could not see my daughter through the dense crowd of shocked guests. She began to shout at the hired staff to kill the power and turn off the projector. When nobody moved, she turned to DeAndre, who was still standing like a statue, his face the color of dry ash. "DeAndre, do something right now," she hissed through her teeth, loud enough for the first 3 rows of guests to hear. "Get over there and unplug that machine before I lose everything." DeAndre finally seemed to snap out of his trance, but it was not the action of a leader or a man with a backbone. He lunged forward, tripping over the expensive silk rug, and scrambled toward the far wall where the primary heavy-duty power cables were tucked behind a decorative floral arrangement. He was sweating so profusely that his silk shirt was sticking to his back, and he looked like a cornered animal trying to escape a trap that had already closed. He began to frantically rip at the thick black cables, his hands trembling so much that he couldn't get a proper grip. The billionaire developer Marcus stepped forward and looked at DeAndre with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, son," Marcus said, his voice deep and carrying the weight of decades of corporate power. "The only thing you are doing right now is confirming your own guilt in front of 50 witnesses and a dozen camera phones." DeAndre didn't stop. He gave a violent tug, and the heavy projector flickered for a second, but Maya had already locked the secondary override system from her remote tablet. The evidence remained frozen on the wall like a permanent scar. Suddenly, the sound of the loud electronic party music was completely cut off by a heavy rhythmic pounding coming from the grand front entrance of the estate. It was not the polite knock of a late guest or the tapping of a neighbor. It was a massive, systematic battering ram impact that shook the entire house to its very foundation. The high-end soundproof windows rattled in their frames, and the crystal ornaments on the mantel clattered together. Before anyone could move, the heavy oak front doors that I had polished myself for 30 years were violently breached. They didn't just open, they swung inward with a thunderous crash as the heavy steel hinges gave way under a massive coordinated force. A group of men and women in dark blue tactical jackets with the bright gold letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice Financial Crimes Unit poured into the foyer. They weren't the private party security Brittany had hired to keep me out. These were federal agents with the authority of the United States government, and they were moving with a lethal military precision that instantly paralyzed the room. The wealthy investors dropped their champagne glasses, and the influencers stopped recording as a lead agent with a sharp gray suit and a silver badge stepped into the center of the grand living room. "Nobody move," the lead agent commanded, his voice booming with an authority that left no room for debate. "Every single person in this house needs to keep their hands where we can see them." The federal agents fanned out across the room, their eyes scanning the crowd with professional coldness. Brittany let out a thin, high-pitched wail of pure terror and tried to hide behind the stone fireplace mantel, but 2 agents were already moving toward her. DeAndre was still huddled on the floor by the cables, looking up at the agents with a hollow, blank expression. I stood my ground and looked at the lead agent, who gave me a very brief, respectful nod. Maya walked down from the tech booth, her face calm and victorious, holding the encrypted tablet that contained the final data logs of every single fraudulent transaction Brittany had attempted to hide. She walked directly to the lead agent and handed him the device. "Special Agent Miller, we have the primary ledger and the recorded confessions ready for your review," Maya said, her voice clear and strong. The agent took the tablet and looked at the screen for a momentary confirmation before turning his focus back to the two people in the center of the room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of formal federal arrest warrants. The lead agent walked straight past the terrified billionaire developers and the stunned guests moving directly toward Brittany. "Brittany Sterling, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud," he announced as he reached for the heavy steel handcuffs on his belt. Brittany began to scream again, but this time there was no arrogance in it. It was the sound of a woman whose fake world had completely vanished. She tried to lunge away toward the kitchen, but an agent caught her by the arm and spun her around with a firm professional grip. I watched as the shiny silver handcuffs were snapped tightly around her manicured wrists. The sound of the metal clicking shut was the most beautiful music I had ever heard in this house. She was sobbing now, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked over at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, hollow plea for help, but I simply adjusted my emerald lapel and looked away. I had spent a week in a backyard shed because of her greed, and I had no mercy left to give. The agents then moved toward DeAndre, who didn't even try to run. He just stood up slowly, his legs shaking, as they secured his wrists behind his back. The golden child was finally being held accountable for the first time in his pampered life. As the agents began to lead them toward the door, the lead agent stopped and looked at the crowd of investors. "I want to thank Yvonne Henderson and Maya Henderson for their extreme bravery and meticulous record-keeping," he said loudly so everyone could hear. "This investigation has been ongoing for several days based on the extensive evidence provided by the family. We have successfully tracked the missing funds from the forged home equity line of credit, and the digital trail is ironclad. I would suggest that everyone here check their own portfolios if they have had business dealings with the Sterling brand, because the entire operation was a fraudulent shell." The room erupted into a fresh wave of hushed, angry voices as the investors realized how close they had come to losing their own fortunes. Susan, Brittany's mother, tried to run out the back door to escape the chaos, but an agent was already waiting for her on the patio. She was caught in the same net her daughter had cast, and she looked like a common thief in her borrowed designer dress. I stood with Maya at the base of the staircase, watching as my son and my daughter-in-law were marched out of the front doors of my home in the back of dark federal vehicles. The party was officially over, and the fake luxury queen was being taken to a place where diamonds and silk robes wouldn't matter. I looked around my living room, which was now filled with the cold blue and red flashing lights from the police cars parked in my circular driveway. The guests were filing out in a silent, somber procession, their heads bowed in shame for being fooled by such a transparent lie. I walked over to the tech booth and turned off the projector, finally clearing the images of the crime from my walls. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a house that had been purged of a deep, toxic infection. Maya put her arm around my shoulder, and we stood there together in the center of our legacy. We had defended the name of our ancestors, and we had saved the home that was built with honest sweat and tears. I looked at the broken front doors, and I knew that tomorrow I would hire a professional to fix them with the strongest wood and the most secure locks money could buy. I was no longer a tenant, and I was no longer a victim. I was the owner of this house, and my word was the only law that mattered here. The rent was finally paid in full, and the cost was the freedom of the people who tried to steal it. I breathed in the scent of the evening air, and I knew that for the first time in a very long time, I was finally home, and I was finally safe. I looked at the empty space where the antique table used to be, and I knew that I would find it and bring it back, because the truth always finds its way home. Justice had arrived, and it was wearing a badge. We were the last ones standing, and we were the only ones who truly knew the value of what was left behind in the quiet of the night. The cold, metallic sound of the heavy silver handcuffs clicking shut was the most honest thing I had heard in this house for weeks. It was a sharp, final sound that cut through the lingering echoes of the loud party music and the frantic whispers of the wealthy guests. The two federal agents standing in the center of my grand living room held Brittany's arms with a firm professional grip that made her expensive diamond gown look like a cheap costume. The arrogance that had fueled her for months had finally evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a raw, naked terror. I stood perfectly still near the catering table, my emerald green silk suit reflecting the harsh blue and red lights from the police cruisers outside. I watched as the reality of her situation finally broke her spirit. Brittany did not look like a luxury mogul anymore. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had closed permanently. She took one deep, gasping breath, and then she turned her head toward DeAndre. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was all his idea. She suddenly screamed, her voice piercing the quiet room like a jagged blade. She began to struggle against the agents, her expensive heels slipping on the polished hardwood floors. I had nothing to do with the bank documents. DeAndre told me he had the legal power of attorney. He was the one who forged the signatures, and he was the one who told me we needed to sell the house to fund the brand expansion. He lied to me, and he lied to his own mother. Do not arrest me for his crimes. He is the one who stole the equity, and he is the one who belongs in a cell. DeAndre looked at his wife with a hollow, shattered expression that I will never forget. He had betrayed his own flesh and blood for a woman who was now throwing him into the fire without a single second of hesitation. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, raspy whisper. He looked at the handcuffs on his own wrists, and then he looked at me. My son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love and sacrifice I possessed, slowly collapsed onto his knees. He did not care about the wealthy investors watching him or the cameras that were still recording the downfall of the Henderson name. He crawled toward me as much as the agents would allow, his head bowed in a posture of pathetic desperation. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched sob that made the guests in the front row wince in disgust. "You have to tell them it was just a misunderstanding. You have to tell the prosecutor that we are a family and that you gave me permission to manage the estate. I am your only son. I am the golden child who made you proud for 30 years. Please, do not let them take me away from my life. We can fix this if we stick together as a family. Loyalty is the only thing that matters now, Mom. Please save me from this nightmare. I will do anything you want. Just do not let these people take me to jail." I looked down at my son, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold professional detachment. The mother who used to bake him peach cobbler and stay up late to help him with his homework had been buried in that tiny backyard guest house. The woman standing here now was a forensic real estate appraiser who only saw a fraudulent asset that needed to be liquidated. My eyes were made of ice as I met his gaze. Family does not forge a mother's legal signature on a $500,000 federal loan. "DeAndre," I said, my voice sounding as steady and cold as a tombstone. "Family does not wait until their mother's 62nd birthday to hand her a formal eviction notice while she is serving them dinner. Family does not lock a 62-year-old woman in a dirty backyard shed so they can host a party in a house they stole from her. You lost the right to speak the word loyalty the moment you picked up that pen and tried to erase my existence for a woman who just told these agents you are a loser. You chose your side, and now you are going to live with the consequences of that choice. I am not your savior today, DeAndre. I am the woman who appraised your character and found it to be completely worthless." While the agents began to haul DeAndre back to his feet, I noticed a flash of beige cashmere moving toward the back of the house. Susan, Brittany's mother, was trying to sneak through the crowd toward the kitchen. She was clutching her designer handbag against her chest and trying to make herself invisible among the shadows of the large potted plants. She was the one who had thrown my historical African-American artwork into the trash, and she was the one who had proudly claimed my master bedroom as her own royal suite. I was not going to let her slip away into the night to find another victim to leech off of. I raised my hand and called out to the federal agents guarding the back patio. "Stop that woman," I said, my voice booming with a fierce authority that stopped Susan in her tracks. Every person in the room turned to look as Susan froze just inches away from the glass sliding doors. She slowly turned around, her fake designer sunglasses hanging off her face and a look of pure panic in her eyes. "I am just a guest," Susan stammered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and the same racist condescension she had used on the driveway. I had nothing to do with their business dealings. I am just a mother visiting her daughter. I am going back to my hotel now, and I suggest you stay out of my way, Yvonne. I walked across the room, the crowd parting for me as if I were a queen, reclaiming her throne. I stopped right in front of Susan and looked her directly in the eyes. "You are not going back to any hotel because you are a bankrupt squatter who just got evicted from your own apartment, Susan," I said loud enough for every single wealthy investor to hear. "You moved into my master bedroom without my permission, and you vandalized my personal property. You are trespassing on private property that is currently under federal investigation. I want you to walk up those stairs right now and gather the cheap luggage you have inside my room. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate the master bedroom and this house before I have these agents add criminal trespassing and destruction of property to your record. You have spent the last week acting like the lady of the manor, but the actual owner is standing right here, and I am telling you to get out of my sight." Susan opened her mouth to argue, but she saw the lead agent stepping toward her with his badge shining in the party lights. She realized that the fake luxury world she had tried to inhabit had been reduced to a pile of ashes. She turned and scrambled up the stairs, her heels clattering on the wood as she fled toward the room she had tried to steal. The federal agents did not wait for her to finish. They began to march Brittany and DeAndre toward the grand foyer. The walk of shame was public, and it was absolute. Brittany was still sobbing and screaming at DeAndre, telling him she hated him and that he had ruined her life. DeAndre was just a hollow shell of a man staring at the floor as he was led past the very billionaire developers he had tried to scam. The wealthy investors stood in 2 long lines, and the influencers held up their phones to capture the final moment of the sterling brand. The flashing blue and red lights from the driveway cast a strobe effect over the room, making the entire scene look like a high-stakes movie climax. Brittany tripped at the doorway, her diamond gown snagging on a piece of broken glass from the champagne flute she had dropped earlier. She looked at the crowd, and then she looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a toxic bitterness that will never fade. I stood with my daughter Maya at the base of the staircase, watching as my own son was pushed into the back of a dark federal SUV. The doors slammed shut with a heavy finality. The fake empire was gone. The luxury brand was a lie. The only things left in the house were the people who had worked for it, and the truth that had saved it. I took a deep breath of the evening air, and I felt the weight of the last 3 decades finally lifting. The fire had burned everything to the ground, but I was still standing, and my house was finally clean. The investigators began to clear the room, and the billionaire developer Marcus came over to me. He shook my hand and told me that he had never seen a more professional takedown in his entire life. He said that my integrity was the only real luxury in the room tonight. I thanked him and watched as he led the remaining guests out the front door. The house was slowly returning to silence, but it was a holy silence now. Maya walked over to me and took my hand. "We did it, Mom," she whispered, her eyes reflecting the quiet victory of the night. I looked around at my formal dining room, which was now empty of the antique table and filled with the residue of a crime. I told her that the house was just wood and stone, but our name was finally safe. I told her that tomorrow we would find that mahogany table and bring it back because the Henderson legacy was not something that could be sold online. Susan came back down the stairs a few minutes later, dragging 2 oversized suitcases behind her. She did not look at us. She just scurried out the door into the darkness of the driveway where a taxi was waiting. She was leaving my house the same way she had lived her life, with nothing but stolen goods and a broken reputation. I walked to the front door and looked out at the street. The federal vehicles were driving away, their sirens silent now because the work was done. The fake empire was reduced to ashes, and I was the one who had lit the match. I turned back to my house, and I knew that the rent was finally paid in full. I was Yvonne Henderson, and I was home. The emerald green of my suit felt like a badge of honor as I walked through the quiet rooms. The scents of the expensive catered food and the heavy perfume were already starting to fade. I opened the windows to let the night air in, to purge the last of the toxic energy. I looked at the spot where DeAndre had fallen to his knees, and I felt a brief flash of sorrow, but it was the sorrow of a woman mourning a ghost. My son had died a long time ago when he let greed replace his heart. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. The guest house in the backyard looked small and lonely through the window, but I was not afraid of it anymore. It was just a building now, not a prison. I knew that in the morning I would have the locks changed one last time, and the codes would only be known by me and Maya. I looked at the projector on the wall, and I saw the final image that Maya had left up. It was a picture of my first appraisal license from 30 years ago. It was a reminder of who I was before the house and before the children. I was a woman of value. I was a woman of truth. The karma had been served cold, and it was the most satisfying meal I had ever had. The night was peaceful, and the house was mine. I sat down in my favorite chair, and I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of my own steady breath. The war was over, and I had won. The blue and red lights finally disappeared from the driveway, leaving the house in the soft silver light of the moon. Maya and I sat in the living room for a long time, just breathing in the quiet. We did not need to talk about the legalities or the prison sentences that were coming. We just needed to be in a space that was finally ours again. I looked at the walls, and I saw the spots where Susan's cheap decorations had been, and I knew that tomorrow we would tear them down. We would find my artwork, and we would put it back where it belonged. I told Maya that I was proud of her for standing by me when everyone else was blinded by the flash of fake diamonds. She told me that she had just been following my lead. The Henderson women were the real estate of this family, and our value was only going to go up from here. I looked out the window, and I saw the first hint of the morning sun starting to touch the oak trees. It was a new day, and the ashes of the fake empire were being blown away by the wind. I was Yvonne Henderson, and I was the only lady of the manor. The rent was paid, and the lease was eternal. I was finally at peace in the home I had built with my own hands. I looked at the floor where the golden child had crawled, and I knew that the real gold was the integrity that was still standing in the room. The story was over, and the justice was complete. I walked to my master bedroom, and I laid down on my own bed for the first time in a week. The sheets were fresh, and the room was mine. I fell asleep with a smile on my face, knowing that the cold-served karma was the best birthday present I could ever receive. The world was right again. The absolute silence of the house was a comfort I had not realized I was missing until the chaos of the party had fully cleared. I thought about the billionaire developers and how they had looked at me with a respect that no amount of Britney's fake branding could ever buy. I had shown them that a woman of 62 with a sharp mind and a moral compass is the most formidable force in any market. I realized that my retirement was not going to be a quiet fading away, but a new chapter of strength. I had reclaimed my kingdom, and I had protected my daughter. As I watched the dawn break over the horizon, I felt a surge of energy for the work ahead. We had a lot of things to fix and a lot of stolen items to recover, but we had the most important thing of all. We had the truth. The story of the birthday eviction would be told for years as a warning to anyone who thought they could underestimate a mother who knows her worth. I closed the curtains and finally let the darkness of a peaceful sleep take me. The karma was cold, but my heart was finally warm. I was home, and I was safe, and I was free. The fake empire was gone, and the real legacy was just beginning. I was the master of my own domain and the appraiser of my own soul. The end of the war was the beginning of my life. I was Yvonne Henderson, and I was the winner. The cold karma had settled, and the fire was out. The ashes were all that remained of the lies, and I was ready to sweep them away in the morning light. I am home. I am here. I am whole. The house is mine. The truth is mine. The victory is mine. The karma is served. I am finally and truly at peace in the kingdom I built. The golden child is gone, and the golden integrity remains. I am Yvonne Henderson, and this is my home. The silence is a song of victory, and I am the only one singing it tonight in the house of my dreams. The karma was cold, but the payoff was worth every single second of the heat. I am finally home. I am finally at rest. I am finally free. The empire of lies is gone, and the truth is the only thing left standing in the morning sun. I am Yvonne Henderson, and I am the lady of this house forever. The end. This is the truth. This is the karma. This is the cold-served reality. I am home. The metallic clicking of the silver handcuffs will forever be the sound of my personal Independence Day. Every time I think about that sharp sound, I will remember that I am a woman who cannot be broken by greed or betrayal. I will remember that my daughter Maya is a warrior and that our bond is stronger than any fraudulent deed. I will remember that my home is a fortress of my own making and that I am the only one with the keys. The sunset of the fake empire is the sunrise of my own truth. I am Yvonne Henderson, and I am the appraiser of my own worth. The karma was served cold, and it was exactly what I needed to finally see the light. I am home, and I am safe, and I am loved. The war is over, and the peace is here to stay in the halls of my beautiful estate. I am finally and truly home. The karma is served, and the truth remains. I am Yvonne Henderson. I am whole. I am free. The cold karma has finished its work, and the house is finally still. The dawn has come, and the shadows are gone. I am at peace. The rent is paid, and the life is mine. I am Yvonne Henderson, and I am home. The cold-served karma was the best gift of all. The golden child was a fake, but the mother is real. I am here, and I am home. The end of the lies is the beginning of my true life. I am Yvonne Henderson. I am home. The cold karma is done. The fire is out. The house is mine. I am home. The karma is served. The truth is standing. I am at rest. I am free. The fake empire is ashes, and I am the queen of the truth. I am home. The end. The federal courtroom was a cold, sterile place where the truth finally stripped away every single layer of the fake luxury lifestyle my son and his wife had tried to project for the world. I sat in the front row wearing a simple charcoal gray suit and my head held high watching as the judge delivered the final crushing blow to their greedy and destructive ambitions. DeAndre and Brittany were both officially sentenced to 18 years in a federal correctional facility with no possibility of early parole for the first 12 years. Because the crimes involved massive federal bank fraud, identity theft, and systemic wire fraud, the court also ordered them to pay back every single penny of the stolen $500,000 plus hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional legal fees and restitution to the bank. They are now facing a mountain of crushing debt that will follow them for the rest of their natural lives. Brittany tried to put on a performance for the news cameras one last time during the sentencing, but her tears were dry and her face was a mask of hollow desperation. She is no longer a luxury influencer with 1 million followers. She is just a numerical identifier in the Federal Bureau of Prisons system. She lost the diamond gowns, the expensive leased cars, and the fake prestige she had spent my stolen equity to acquire. DeAndre looked like a ghost of the man I used to know as he was led out of the courtroom in heavy shackles. He never looked at me, and I never looked away from him. Brittany's mother, Susan, was not officially charged with the bank fraud because she was too far removed from the actual paperwork, but her daily life is now arguably much worse than prison. Since she was completely broke and already legally evicted from her luxury high-rise, she is now living in a tiny, cramped room at a cheap motel on the edge of town. She spent decades looking down on people who actually worked for a living, and now she is realizing that her daughter's stolen wealth was her only ticket to the lifestyle she craved. She has no car, no designer clothes, and no friends left to manipulate. The people she tried so hard to impress at the launch party have all blocked her calls and erased her from their social circles. The fake empire has completely crumbled into a pile of fine white ash, and there is nothing left for them to salvage. I do not feel joy in their suffering, but I do feel a profound sense of peace, knowing that they can never hurt this family again. The legal system finally finished the job that my forensic appraisal had started, and the balance of justice has been restored to my life. The house feels entirely different now that the toxic energy has been thoroughly and permanently purged from the hallways. I spent several weeks systematically removing every single piece of cheap modern furniture and fake gold decoration Brittany had brought into my private space. I hired a professional cleaning crew to scrub the floors and the walls until the scent of her expensive perfume was completely replaced by the fresh, clean smell of lemon oil and beeswax. The most incredible moment of the entire restoration was when the local police department contacted me to say they had recovered my antique mahogany dining table. It had been found in a dusty third-party warehouse after the private buyer realized it was stolen property and reported it to the authorities to avoid being charged with receiving stolen goods. When the movers brought the table back and placed it in the center of my formal dining room, I ran my hand over the dark, scarred wood and felt a sense of completion that I cannot describe. Every scratch and every dent in that wood is a part of our history, and I refuse to ever hide them again. I also commissioned a talented local artist to create a new massive series of historical paintings to replace the traditional African American artwork Susan had tossed in the trash. The new artwork is more vibrant and more powerful than the original collection, representing the resilience, the rebirth, and the absolute survival of this house. I called my daughter Maya into my private study yesterday morning to have a conversation that was 10 years in the making. I looked at her, the child who had always been the designated scapegoat of this family, and the one who had actually saved my entire life with her brilliant legal mind, and I felt a profound sense of maternal pride. I told her that she was no longer just a named beneficiary of the estate. I had my attorney draft a new set of formal documents that officially transfer all executor rights of the irrevocable trust directly to her. I wanted her to know that her unwavering loyalty, her inner strength, and her sharp professional intellect were the most valuable assets this family ever possessed. DeAndre had chosen the path of greed and betrayal, but Maya had chosen the path of truth and protection. For her loyalty, she was being rewarded with full control of the legacy her father and I worked so hard to build. She sat across from me in the leather chair, and for the first time in years, I saw her completely relax her shoulders. We both knew the war was finally over, and the house was finally safe in the hands of someone who truly understands its worth. Tonight we sat down together at the antique mahogany table for our first quiet meal as a family of two. I had cooked a simple traditional dinner of roasted chicken, savory collard greens, and fresh garden vegetables. There was no loud electronic music, no fake laughter for social media, and no hidden agendas lurking in the shadows of the room. The dining room was filled with a beautiful, deep silence that felt like a warm, heavy blanket protecting us from the outside world. We did not talk about the federal trials, the prison sentences, or the people we had to leave behind in the fire. We talked about the future and the new memories we were going to build within these four walls. The house is no longer a target for predators or a stage for a fake brand. It is once again a sanctuary for the people who actually belong here. I looked at Maya across the table, and I realized that while I lost a son, I finally truly found a daughter. We are the survivors of a storm that tried to wash us away, and we are standing stronger than we ever have before. Money and greed can easily blind the people you love, making them do things you never thought possible. They can turn a son against a mother and a sister against a brother for the sake of a fake luxury lifestyle. But the truth is a living thing, and it always survives the fire of betrayal. You have to be willing to look at the people you love and see them for who they truly are, even if the reality is painful. You have to be brave enough to build boundaries made of solid steel to protect your peace, your assets, and your legacy. Standing your ground does not make you a villain. It makes you a guardian of your own worth. Never let anyone, even your own blood, tell you that you are defeated or that you owe them your life. Respect is the only currency that matters in a home, and if they cannot pay that rent, then they have no business living under your roof. I am Yvonne Henderson, and I am finally and truly home. Have you ever had to legally or emotionally evict a toxic family member from your life to protect your own sanity? How did you find the strength to set those ironclad boundaries and protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments below, because your journey might be the exact light someone else needs to find their way out of the darkness. If my story gave you the strength to stand up for yourself today, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of setting boundaries and reclaiming your power from those who try to steal it. Remember that respect is the real rent, and if they cannot pay it, they have to get out. Your home is your kingdom, and your peace is your right. Do not ever settle for anything less than absolute loyalty and truth from the people you allow into your circle. Thank you for watching and for standing with me through this long journey. I hope you find the same peace in your home that I have finally found in mine tonight. God bless you, and stay strong in your truth. As the sun sets over my backyard, I can see the small guest house where I once sat in the dark feeling like a prisoner. It is just a building now, a quiet, empty space that serves as a reminder of a battle won. I will probably turn it into a library or an art studio for Maya, a place for creativity and growth instead of fear and hiding. The locks on the main house are brand new, and the codes are only known by the people who love me. The mahogany table is polished and the artwork is hanging on the walls. The air is clear and the house is still. I am no longer looking over my shoulder or waiting for the next betrayal to strike. I am living my life on my own terms in the house I built with my own hands. The fake empire is a memory, and the new legacy is built on a foundation of honesty and strength. I am home, and I am safe, and I am free. The rent is paid in full, and the lease on my peace is eternal. I am Yvonne Henderson, and this is my empire of truth. Goodbye to the lies, and hello to the rest of my life.